I first heard the claim in a courtyard where old men argue the way other people pray. They said 700 Spartan veterans had shattered 40,000 invaders in a single charge, as if the world could be split like a clay jar, one clean blow, and history would pour out in a straight line. I was younger then, still arrogant enough to believe numbers behaved themselves, still naive enough to think war was only geometry, ranks, angles, and spear points. But the story wouldn't leave me. Not because I trusted the arithmetic. No, any careful reader of the old records learns early that numbers are the easiest part of history to lie about. It stayed with me because every time it was told, the teller's voice changed at the same places. When the veterans tightened their cloaks against a cold wind, when the invaders' fires brightened the horizon like a second sunset, when the Spartan commander spoke a line so quiet you had to lean in to hear it. There was always a pause, too, before the charge. And I learned, after many winters and many scrolls, that the pause is where truth hides. The moments before the spurline moves, those moments are the same whether the army is 700 or 70,000. Men do not become statistics until after they are dead. So I went looking for the pause. I traveled to the kind of place that never makes it into the clean, triumphant summaries. Not a shining city, not a famous pass with a name easy to remember, but a hard strip of borderland where the earth turns bitter, where stones outnumber trees, where the air tastes faintly of iron. A place where people build their homes low because wind and war both come without warning. An old shrine stood there, broken at the corners, its steps worn down by feet that had climbed up to bargain with the gods. Someone had tied faded ribbons on the remaining pillar, and the cloth moved like tired hands. I stood among the weeds and tried to imagine the sound of a phalanx forming up, the scrape of bronze, the cough of men clearing throats, the quiet curses as shield straps were tightened. They told me the veterans had gathered at night. Not with drums, not with banners, but with the kind of discipline that makes noise feel like a betrayal. 700 not boys. Men who had already survived what should have killed them. Some were missing pieces of themselves. A finger gone, a patch of hair burned away on one side of a scalp. Some walked with a stiffness that spoke of old spear wounds in the hip or knee. A few had the calm eyes of men who had watched friends die and learned the sick trick of continuing to breathe afterward. They were veterans, yes, but more than that, they were men Sparta had used and not yet discarded. Sparta always claimed it did not love, it claimed it only trained. But I have never believed a city can raise men like that without loving something, if not individuals, then at least an idea so fierce it burns like devotion. And devotion, when you look at it closely, is only love that has learned to wear armor. Their commander, as far as I can piece together, was named Ariston. The name appears only once in a surviving list, written in a quick hand beside other names that end abruptly, as if the scribe knew he might die before finishing the line. Ariston was not a king. That matters. Kings are too easy to remember. A king's story comes pre-packaged for bards. Ariston was the kind of man history forgets, unless something impossible happens around him. What I know of him comes from fragments. A sentence quoted by a later writer, a remark attributed to the Spartan, as if his personal name were unnecessary, and a piece of pottery with a crude drawing of a man in a crested helmet standing beside a smaller figure, perhaps a boy. That boy, I think, mattered. Because the story is never only about the line of shields, it is about what stands behind it. They say a messenger arrived at dusk with dust ground into his hair and blood stiff at the edge of his tunic. He did not collapse theatrically. He did not deliver his warning in poetry. He simply spoke the facts, because that is how men talk when they have seen too much. An army was moving in from the north and east. Not one banner but many. Not one people but a coalition of hungry nations, raiders and exiles and ambitious lords who smelled weakness the way wolves smell a limping deer. They had heard that Sparta's main strength was elsewhere, tied down by politics and distant promises. They had heard the border towns were thinly held. 40,000, the messenger said. The number landed in the room like a stone dropped into water. It made ripples in men's faces. Even Spartans, especially Spartans, knew what it meant to be outnumbered. Discipline does not erase arithmetic, it only teaches you to look at it without blinking. Somewhere nearby, a woman laughed sharply once. Not joy, not mockery. The sound people make when fear and anger collide and produce something like steam. Her name, in the accounts I've gathered, was Thaleia. And this is where the story becomes more than a war tale. Because Thaleia was not a soldier. She was the widow of a border officer, killed 2 years earlier in a skirmish so minor it barely earned ink. Thalia had remained on that land not because she had nowhere else to go, but because leaving would have admitted that death can evict the living. She ran a small house where travelers were fed, where gossip gathered like smoke in rafters, where men drank and tried to pretend they were not afraid of tomorrow. She was, by all indications, fiercely intelligent and dangerously honest. The kind of woman Sparta admired publicly and resented privately. In a city that trained men to control their faces, Thalia's face was a blade. She could cut you without touching you. When the messenger spoke, she was there, serving water with hands that did not shake. And she looked at Ariston in a way that made several men glance away, not because the look was romantic, not yet, but because it was intimate in the oldest sense. She looked at him as if she understood exactly what the number meant and what it would do to a man's insides. Ariston's eyes, they say, did not soften. Spartan faces are not built for softness in public. But he held her gaze a fraction longer than was necessary, and in that sliver of time something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or the mutual hatred of helplessness. I have seen that look in other places, in other wars. It is the look of two people who know that courage is not the absence of fear, and that love, if it appears at all, often appears at the edge of disaster like a torch lit in a storm. That night the veterans assembled in a low building of stone. No singing, no speeches meant for posterity. They ate quickly because a full stomach can become a liability. They checked their spearheads with a thumb lightly to feel for nicks. They adjusted the leather that held greaves to shin. They did all the small, practical acts that prevent the mind from screaming. One of them, a man called Menon, sat apart and sharpened his short sword longer than was necessary. Menon had fought in 3 campaigns. He was known for his left-handed thrust that came in under a shield's rim. He also had a habit, noted by one later writer, of whispering the names of dead friends before battle. Another veteran, Kyros, was younger than most but already carried himself like an old man. He had been taken into training late, an orphan, they said, and had something to prove always. He was the kind of man who mistook ferocity for certainty. Ariston had corrected him more than once, not with kindness but with something better, attention. And then there was Dorion's. Dorion is the one the bards would have loved if bards had been allowed anywhere near this. Tall, beautiful in a blunt way, with the sort of grin that makes people believe tomorrow will be survivable. But Dorion was not a fool. He joked because he had learned that a frightened man becomes selfish, and selfishness fractures a line faster than any enemy spear. A fourth name appears only in a marginal note, Euenos, not a famous warrior, just a man who had once been a farmer. The note says he carried a small piece of cloth in his cuirass, a woman's weaving, the writer guessed. That small detail has haunted me more than the grandest claims of heroism. Because it is so human. Because a piece of cloth is not strategy, it is a vow. Toward midnight, Thaleia entered the building without asking permission. People forget that Spartan women, especially women hardened by border life, did not always behave like the tame figures foreigners imagined. Thaleia walked straight to Ariston and placed something on the table, a sealed jar of oil for wounds, a roll of clean linen, and a small bronze mirror with a crack in it. Men looked at the mirror strangely. It was not practical, it was not food, it was not a weapon. Ariston didn't ask, he waited. Thaleia said, "So you remember your faces." In the room, someone exhaled slowly. Ariston's voice when he spoke was quiet. "We will remember enough." Thaleia leaned closer, not seductively, but urgently, as if time itself had become a blade at her back. "They say 40,000. I heard. They say you have 700. I counted." Her mouth tightened. For a heartbeat, the mask cracked and grief showed, the kind of grief that is always present in war zones, sitting in the corner like smoke you cannot chase out. "Then do what you came to do," she said, "but do it like men who know someone is watching." Ariston's gaze flicked to the cracked mirror. "I know," he said. And then, in a moment so small it could be missed, he touched the jar of oil with 2 fingers, an acknowledgement. A thank you without the embarrassment of words. Thaleia turned to leave, and Dorion, who could not help himself, murmured, "If we live, I'll drink your wine again." She didn't turn back. "If you live," she said, "you'll pay for it." Laughter, soft, brief, moved through the men like warmth through a cold room. It wasn't happiness. It was a reminder of a world where debts mattered, where tomorrow could contain something other than blood. That laughter, I think, is part of why they held. Before dawn, scouts returned with confirmation. The invaders were near enough that you could see their campfires from the ridge, scattered like a spilled constellation. You could hear faintly the distant noise of an army that believed it had already won, horns testing notes, men shouting across fires, the clatter of cooking pots. Ariston climbed the ridge with a few officers and looked down at the valley. Even in the half-light, the enemy mass was undeniable, waves of bodies, tents, animals, carts, a moving city of hunger. Someone beside him, perhaps Menon, muttered, "They'll drown us." Ariston replied, "Then we will be the rock." That line appears in no official record. I suspect it was remembered because it was the kind of sentence people cling to when logic offers nothing. He turned and looked back at his 700. They were arrayed in small clusters, checking gear, speaking quietly, urinating against stones without shame. One man prayed, another spat. A third sat with his eyes closed, breathing as if he were preparing to lift a heavy weight. And at the edge of the gathering, half hidden behind a low wall, a boy watched. Yes, this is the boy I mentioned. I believe his name was Niko. He was too young to fight, but old enough to understand what was happening. Border children grow up fast. Niko had been helping Thaleia at the house since his father died. He carried water, swept floors, listened to men speak of war as if it were weather. Now he watched the veterans with a reverence so intense it was almost painful to witness. He was watching the only thing standing between the valley and the homes behind it. Ariston noticed him. He walked over and the boy stiffened as if expecting to be struck for being in the way. Spartans were not gentle with children. They believed gentleness made weakness, but Ariston did not strike. He crouched, bringing his face level with Niko. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Niko swallowed, watching. "Go back." Niko's jaw tightened. "My mother is there." Ariston paused. There are pauses in war that decide more than charges do. He reached to his own cloak and tore off a narrow strip, rough wool, dark with use. He wrapped it around the boy's wrist and tied it with the practiced motion of a man binding a wound. "Stay behind the stone wall," he said. "If you hear horns, you run. If you see smoke, you run." Niko stared at the knot as if it were a sacred sign. "And if I don't run," the boy whispered. Ariston's eyes, they say, were hard but not cruel. "Then you die," he said plainly, "and your mother loses you before she loses the house." Niko's throat bobbed. "Will you die?" Ariston didn't answer immediately. This is the thing about leaders. The lie is tempting. It would be easy, even kind, to say no. But kindness built on lies is a weak foundation. He said, "Some of us will, maybe all, but we will decide when." Then he stood and walked away, leaving the boy with a strip of cloak and a truth heavy enough to shape a life. When the sun finally broke the horizon, it revealed the valley fully. The invaders were moving. The veterans formed up. 700 shields lifted, bronze flashed, spears angled forward like a single organism's teeth. And the world for a moment held its breaths. The last thing I can confirm from any reliable source is this: Ariston did not wait to be surrounded. He did not allow the enemy to settle into their numbers to wrap the Spartan line like a net. He chose movement, and he chose violence, and he chose it early. A single charge, they said. One. Not a series of careful pushes. Not a slow retreat. A sudden, brutal forward surge meant to shatter the enemy's confidence before it could harden into certainty. But what that charge cost, what it felt like in the men's lungs, what it sounded like when 700 voices roared against 40,000, those details live only in the space between fact and memory. And that is where I will take you next. Because the charge was not the beginning. The beginning was the pause. And the pause is over. When people imagine a charge, they imagine speed. They imagine the moment a line breaks into a run, the earth shaking, the enemy startled into panic. They imagine it like a painting, clean, heroic, almost simple. But a Spartan charge, especially from veterans, was not frantic. It was not a mob. It was a machine deciding to move. The first sound was not shouting, it was leather. The creak of shield straps tightening across forearms, the quiet slap of palms checking grip, the thin, metallic rasp as spear butts were set and reset against stone to find purchase. Men exhaled through their noses the way you do before stepping into cold water. Ariston walked the front, not with grand gestures, but with the calm of a man counting his own heartbeat. Hold your spacing, he said, not for me, for the man beside you. That was how Spartans spoke when they were being honest, not for Sparta, not for glory. Those were words for ceremonies. On a border ridge with 40,000 below, the truth was simpler. You stayed in line because your life was stitched to the lives around you. Menon stood in the first rank, left side, where his left-handed thrust could be used best. His jaw worked as if he were chewing the names of the dead. Kyros was a step behind him, second rank, eager in a way that made older men distrust him. He shifted his weight too often, like a hound straining at a leash. Ariston had placed him there on purpose. If Kyros was going to burn, better he burn behind a wall of shields until he learned what fire was for. Dorion was on the right, near the edge. Edges were always danger. The center could be supported, the edge could be flanked. Dorion had the kind of awareness that kept edges from collapsing. He could see movement the way hawks see mice in grass. Euenos, the former farmer, was not in the first rank. He was deeper. His shoulders were broader than a soldier. They belonged to lifting, not killing. And yet he held his spear with the careful respect of a man holding something holy. He touched his cuirass once, where that scrap of weaving lay hidden, then he steadied his breathing and looked forward. Behind them, on the ridge, Thaleia stood in the half-shadow of the stone buildings. She wasn't supposed to be there. No one had told her to leave because no one wanted to speak to her like she was weak. Sparta did not always treat its women kindly, but it did not treat them like ornaments either, at least not on the border. Everyone knew Thaleia's house fed the living and held the dead before burial. Everyone knew she had carried bodies with her own hands. Her eyes were fixed on the phalanx like a person watching the only door in a burning room. And beside her, Niko held the stone wall with both hands, knuckles white, the strip of Ariston's cloak tied around his wrist like a promise that hurt. Down in the valley, the invaders had begun to arrange themselves the way large forces always do, messy at first, confident, slow. Their scouts rode ahead like flies. They had banners and drums and horns because big armies love noise. Noise makes men feel more numerous than they are. The coalition didn't look like one people, it looked like appetite. Different armor, different shields. Some wore bronze, some wore leather, some wore nothing but thick cloth and the arrogance of numbers. There were tall men with heavy axes, there were quick men with bows, there were riders who believed speed could replace discipline. They were not cowards. That mattered. A cowardly army breaks easily. A brave, large army can become a wave that simply keeps coming even as it bleeds. Ariston watched them for a long moment. He was not praying, he was reading. A commander reads an enemy the way a physician reads a wound, not to admire it, to decide where to cut. He turned slightly, enough for the front rank to hear. "We will not stand here," he said. It was not a question. Somewhere behind, someone muttered, "Then where?" Ariston's answer was a single word, "There." And he pointed, not down into the deepest mass of the enemy, but to a place where the coalition's lines were still forming, where contingents met and didn't quite trust each other, where the seam between leaders always shows. That was the truth of large armies. They looked like one beast, but they were stitched together from many. If you hit the stitching hard enough, the beast comes apart. Menon's lips twitched. "A seam," he murmured, almost pleased. Kyros leaned forward. "We can break them." Ariston didn't correct him. "Not now. Let the young man believe." Belief could hold a spear steady for a few more heartbeats. Then Ariston raised his arm. Not high, not theatrical, just enough. 700 shields lifted as one, the bronze faces catching the rising sun until it looked, for a moment, like a wall of fire. The invaders noticed then. You could see it in the way heads turned, in the way some men laughed, pointing, because from below, 700 looks like an insult. It looks like a city throwing its leftovers at a flood. A horn sounded from the invader side, then another. Riders began to move, fanning out, anticipating a slow Spartan defense. Ariston's arm dropped, and the Spartan line moved. At first it was a walk, measured, heavy, the sound of sandals and boots biting dirt, the synchronized thud of shield rims brushing. The phalanx descended the ridge like a single creature with a spine of spears. They did not shout immediately. Spartans saved breath. Shouting too early turns a charge into a sprint, and sprinting makes a man tired before the killing even starts. But the invaders began to shout for them. Mockery from a distance is always easy. The first arrows came not as a storm, but as testing rain. A few hissed down, striking shields with sharp taps. One arrow glanced off a helmet and spun away. Another found a gap near a shoulder and a man grunted, staggered, then recovered as the ranks closed around him. Uinos flinched at the sound of arrows hitting bronze. He had heard it before, but hearing is different when it is your own shield being struck. Still, he did not break formation. He kept his eyes forward like a man walking into a field to harvest grain, except the grain was death. Then the arrows thickened. "Shields up," someone called. The front rank angled their shields and the second rank raised theirs slightly, creating a sloped roof. The sound became louder, dozens of impacts, a hard, relentless drumming. Men behind pressed closer. The line tightened. That was the first test, not courage but obedience. And it held. Kyros's breath came fast. He wanted to run. Every young man wants to run because the body believes speed can outpace fear. But he was pinned in place by the man in front of him, pressed into discipline like clay into a mold. He hated it, and he needed it. The invader riders moved now, circling like fish around a shipwreck. They had expected Sparta to dig in and wait. Instead, they saw the Spartans coming down the ridge in an orderly descent, refusing to be patient prey. Some riders charged early, overconfident, eager to be the first to break the famous line. They hit the Spartan spears and died like arrogance always dies, quickly surprised. One horse impaled itself and screamed, a sound so terrible that even veterans feel something twist inside. The rider flew and struck the ground. Dorion's spear point dipped and rose again, the motion practiced, almost gentle. Menon's left-handed thrust took a rider under the ribs where armor didn't cover. The man's face changed in an instant, from fury to confusion, then he was gone. The riders retreated, yelling warnings, and the coalition's infantry surged forward to cover the humiliation. Now the valley began to close. Dust rose, shouts thickened, drums beat, horns answered. The seam Ariston had chosen was still there, but it was narrowing as enemy contingents met and tried to align. If the Spartans didn't hit it now, they would hit a wall instead. Ariston let them walk faster. The step became a jog. The shields rattled, sandals slid. Men's mouths opened as breath became urgent. And then finally the shout came, not a wild scream but a disciplined roar, a sound drawn from the belly and shaped like a weapon. It rolled down the ridge and hit the invader line like a slap. Even a large army can feel fear, especially a large army, because in a mass of 40,000, each man is less responsible and therefore more easily infected. Panic spreads fastest where responsibility is thinnest. The first clash wasn't one single impact. It was a series of impacts across the Spartan front as spearpoints found flesh, as shields struck shields, as bodies collided. The seam buckled. You could see it. Later survivors described it the same way, like cloth tearing. One contingent of invaders hesitated, unsure whether to step forward, because the men beside them wore different colors and spoke a different tongue. Another contingent pushed too early, trying to be brave alone. The timing was wrong. Their formation was wrong. Ariston had bet everything on that wrongness. Spartan spears drove in. The phalanx didn't just stab, it pushed. This is what people misunderstand. A phalanx is not a row of individual fighters. It is weight. It is a moving wall. It kills not only with points but with pressure. It denies the enemy space to swing, space to think, space to breathe. Dorion at the edge saw the first attempt to flank, men rushing wide, hopping to wrap around the Spartan right. He shouted a warning and shifted his section like a door swinging shut. Shields overlapped, spears angled outward. The flanking men met a sudden barrier and stumbled into it, surprised to find intelligence where they expected stubbornness. Menon fought with a grim calm. He stabbed, withdrew, stabbed again. Once he took a blade across the shield rim that jolted his arm numb. His face didn't change, only his breathing did, shorter, harsher. Kyros in the second rank began to understand what discipline meant. He wasn't free, he was bound. But that binding kept him alive because every time the front rank killed and stepped forward, Kyros filled the space, keeping the wall from thinning. He stabbed over shoulders, aiming down into throats and collarbones when openings appeared. Blood sprayed warm onto his hands. He almost vomited. Then he swallowed it back because there was no time to be human. Uinos saw a man in front of him take a spear in the thigh and go down. Instinct screamed at him to stop, to help, to lift the wounded. But the line cannot stop for one man. If it does, 10 die. If 10 die, 100 die. If the wall breaks, everyone dies. So Uinos did the cruelest thing a decent man can do in war. He stepped over his fallen comrade and kept pushing. Later, I found a small note scratched into a piece of wood, possibly from Uinos, possibly from someone who watched him. It said, "I hated myself, but I held." That is the kind of sentence no liar writes. It is too ugly to be propaganda. The invaders began to fold at the seam. Not because they were all killed, not because they were cowards. Because they could not coordinate fast enough against a force that moved like a single thought. And now the claim you've heard, one charge, began to make its dark kind of sense. Because Ariston did not pause to celebrate the first break. He did not stop to loot. He did not stop to take prisoners. He drove forward straight into the widening gap, turning the charge into a wedge. The Spartans were not trying to kill 40,000 in open combat. No one with a brain would attempt that. They were doing something subtler and more terrifying. They were carving into the center of a huge army to make the huge army fight itself. As the wedge went in, invader units on either side lost sight of each other. Orders shouted by one leader didn't reach the next. Men began to turn to look for signals to guess. Guessing in war is death. A group of invaders, thinking the Spartans were trying to break through and run, rushed to close behind them, only to collide with their own allies coming forward. Shields clanged, men cursed in different languages. Someone struck someone else by mistake. Then someone struck back. A coalition can collapse not from defeat, but from misunderstanding. Ariston kept the wedge tight. He was everywhere and nowhere, moving along the line, striking when needed, grabbing a shield rim to pull a man back into place, shoving another forward. He was not the strongest, not the most beautiful, not the loudest. He was the man who could keep 700 men thinking the same thought, while 40,000 tried to drown them in noise. And still, this was the moment where love, of all things, entered the battlefield like an arrow finding a gap. Because when the wedge drove deeper, it drew the fighting closer to the edge of the border settlement, closer to the stone buildings, closer to Thaleia's house, closer to where Niko was watching. The invaders on the flank, frustrated, began to drift toward the village not as a tactic but as a predator instinct. If you cannot kill the wall, burn what the wall protects. Smoke began to rise from somewhere, some hut or storehouse struck by a flaming arrow. Thaleia saw it first, of course she did. She lived by reading danger the way others read weather. Her hand flew to her mouth not in melodrama but in calculation. Fire spreads fast in dry season. If the village caught, the Spartans would have a choice, continue the wedge or turn back to save what was behind them. Either choice could kill them. Niko made a sound, a small broken noise. Thaleia grabbed his shoulder hard enough to hurt. Behind the wall, she hissed. But now, he hesitated because children always believe there will be time later. Thaleia didn't believe in later. She pushed him down behind stone, and then unbelievably she ran not away but toward the smoke-gathering buckets, shouting to other women, to old men, to anyone with hands. The border settlement had no soldiers to spare. It had only the stubborn. And there, at the edge of battle, while 700 veterans pushed into a sea of bodies, a widow and a boy and a handful of villagers fought a second war. Against fire, against terror, against the sickening certainty that if the Spartans failed, the invaders would pour through like water through a broken dam. On the field, Dorion saw invaders peeling off toward the buildings and swore. He looked to Ariston for a signal, but Ariston was deep in the wedge, and signals don't travel well inside chaos. Dorion made a choice. It was the kind of choice that gives a man a place in a story. He pulled 20 men from his edge, only 20 because the wall cannot afford more, and swung them outward in a sharp hook not to chase but to punish, to show the invaders that raiding the village would cost them blood. Menon, noticing the shift, compensated without being told, tightening his section, taking on more pressure. Veterans do that. They patch holes the way sailors patch sails in a storm. Kyros felt the wall thin and panic flared. Then he did something rare for a young man. He stopped trying to be brave. He tried to be useful. He stepped forward into the gap, his shoulder pressed into shield rims, his spear stabbing mechanically. Later, he would remember that moment as the first time he felt like a Spartan rather than a boy pretending. The wedge drove another dozen paces. The enemy line ahead began to splinter. You could see men turning their heads looking backward, shouting questions. Where is our left? Where is our right? Who is in command? And the Spartans answered those questions with spear points. But the cost was rising. A man in the front rank took a blade up under the helmet and dropped without sound. Another was dragged out by comrades, his legs trailing. Blood made the ground slick. Men slipped, recovered, pushed on. Ariston's shield was dented now. His spear broke and he took another from a fallen Spartan without ceremony. War is not sentimental, it cannot be. Still, there are moments of terrible intimacy. At one point, a young invader, barely more than a boy, lunged at Ariston with a short blade, eyes wide with a desperation that had nothing to do with hatred. Ariston caught the strike on his shield, then drove the spear into the boy's chest. For an instant, their faces were close. The boy's mouth opened as if to speak. No words came. Ariston withdrew the spear and kept moving. A commander cannot stop to grieve each killing. If he did, he would be crushed by his own humanity. Yet I wonder, this is me now older, less arrogant than I was, how many faces Ariston carried afterward, trapped behind his eyes like ghosts. The wedge had gone deep enough that the invader army was no longer one army. It was many frightened groups, each uncertain whether the men shouting beside them were allies or enemies. And that in truth is how a smaller force crushes a larger one. Not by slaughtering every man, but by destroying the thing that makes the many dangerous, unity. Still, the day was young. The charge, if you can still call it a single charge, had not ended. It had become a sustained thrust, a grinding forward violence that could only continue as long as the Spartans could breathe and hold their line. Ariston looked left and right and understood what he had done. He had stabbed the heart. Now he had to twist. Because if he stayed in the center too long, 40,000 would remember they were 40,000. And 700 would become a legend for the wrong reason. He raised his voice, finally truly loud, cutting through the noise. A turn. It was one word. But it was everything. And the wedge began to pivot, shields grinding, spears adjusting, men stepping in unison while surrounded by enemies who suddenly realized, too late, that the Spartans were not merely pushing through. They were about to roll the entire center of the invading host. The valley, filled with dust and screams and sun glare, seemed to tilt. And above it, near the stone wall, Niko lifted his head just enough to see. He would later swear he saw Ariston's crested helmet turn toward the village for a heartbeat, toward Thaleia, toward the smoke, toward the lives behind the shields. And then the Spartan line turned like a blade. And the real crushing began. When Ariston shouted turn, it wasn't just a maneuver. It was a decision about what kind of death they were willing to accept. Forward meant breaking through and escaping the valley, leaving the border settlement to its fate. Forward meant surviving as soldiers and failing as guardians. Turning meant staying inside the enemy's mass, choosing to be surrounded by 40,000 men who, if they found their courage again, could grind 700 into bone. But turning also meant something else, something Spartans understood down to the marrow. If you can't outrun the sea, you make the sea break on you. The pivot began at the point of the wedge like a hinge. Front rank men shifted their feet in small, brutal steps, heels digging into dirt slick with blood. Shields scraped and knocked as they overlapped in a new alignment. Spears re-angled, the points sweeping like a field of reeds in a storm. The movement was slow, painfully slow, because speed would have broken cohesion. The invaders saw it and for a moment didn't understand. Large armies are like large animals, fast to rage, slow to think. They expected the Spartans to keep driving forward, to be trapped by their own momentum. Instead, they watched the Spartan line rotate inside them. Confusion rippled. A group of invaders on the Spartan left surged forward, thinking they'd found an opening, only to meet the newly turned shield wall head-on. Their first few men struck the bronze and recoiled, their formation suddenly wrong. The men behind pressed them forward and bodies jammed. Spears found throats and soft underarms. The seam that Ariston had torn became a wound the enemy could not close. Menon felt the shift before he consciously processed it. Veterans often do. The phalanx speaks through pressure, the weight on your shield changes, the angle of the shove changes, and your body knows what the commander wants before your mind does. Menon grunted, planted his feet, and became part of the pivot's anchor. A heavy axe crashed down on his shield rim, biting bronze and sending a shock through his arm that made his fingers go numb. His face tightened. He didn't step back. He whispered a name, one of the dead or perhaps a living son. No one heard clearly, only that he whispered it all. Kyros behind him saw Menon's arm falter for half a breath and did something instinctively right. He pressed forward, taking some of the weight onto his own shield, becoming the second spine behind the first. His fear didn't vanish. It became fuel, tight and hot in his chest. That is the first lesson in real combat. Fear never leaves. You just learn to carry it without dropping it into the hands of the enemy. Dorion's little detachment, the 20 he'd swung outward, was now in a separate, vicious pocket of fighting near the edge of the village. They had caught the raiders as they approached the first huts. It was not heroic, clean battle. It was close work among low walls and storage sheds where spears were too long and men reached for short blades. Dorion took a slash across his upper arm, blood darkened his tunic instantly. He hissed, not in pain but in anger at his own carelessness. A raider lunged again, wild. Dorion sidestepped and slammed his shield into the man's jaw, teeth cracked. The man went down. Dorion didn't finish him, there was no time, and that almost cost him his life because a second raider came from behind with a hooked knife. One of Dorion's men, an older veteran named Lycan, quiet until now, thrust his spear sideways and skewered the attacker mid-step. Dorion looked at Lycan, eyes sharp. Lycan only said, "Edges." It meant, "I'm watching your back." It also meant, "Don't get sentimental." Near the smoke, Thaleia worked like a person possessed. It's difficult to make fire sound dramatic to an audience that wants steel and blood, but anyone who has watched a village burn knows fire is the most honest terror. Fire doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care if you're brave. It doesn't care if you're innocent. It doesn't take prisoners. A hut's roof had caught dry reeds, fast flame. Thaleia and two other women formed a chain from a well, passing buckets hand to hand. An old man stumbled, spilled water, and began to cry from frustration. Thaleia grabbed him by the shoulders. "Look at me," she snapped. Oh, he looked. "Breathe," she ordered, "now moves." He moved because her voice was the kind of voice you obey when your own mind is falling apart. Niko stayed behind the wall as Ariston had commanded, at first. But children are drawn to catastrophe the way moths are drawn to lamps. He crawled along the inside of the stone barrier until he could see the battlefield in slices. He saw the Spartan wedge turning and he didn't understand tactics. What he understood was this: the Spartans were no longer simply pushing forward. They were inside the enemy, surrounded by shouting men, and still they were moving as if held together by a single invisible rope. He saw Dorion and the small group fighting near the huts, and he saw Thaleia running with buckets, her hair loose now, her face smeared with soot. And then Niko saw something he would never forget. An invader, a man with a curved sword and a foxskin cap, broke away from the press and sprinted toward the village, not to fight Dorion's group but to get around it. His eyes were on the women, on the smoke, on easy prey. He ran low, quick, slipping between bodies and walls like a rat. Thaleia didn't see him. Niko did. He froze for a heartbeat, his mouth open, his chest tight with a fear so big it felt like it would stop his heart. Then he moved. He didn't run like a warrior. He ran like a child, all limbs and panic and desperate love. He grabbed a fallen spear too heavy, the shaft rough against his palms, and dragged it behind him as he stumbled out from cover. Someone shouted at him, maybe Thaleia, maybe another villager. The sound was swallowed by battle noise. The invader saw Niko and laughed, truly laughed, because what is a child with a spear against a grown man with a sword? Niko's hands shook so badly the spearpoint wobbled. But he remembered Ariston's voice, plain and merciless: "If you don't run, you die." And he thought not of his own death but of Thaleia's. He lowered the spear like he'd seen men do. The invader lunged, sword flashing. Niko closed his eyes. And the invader's laugh became a grunt, then a gurgle. Because the sword never reached Niko. An arrow had struck the invader from the side, punching through his throat. The man fell in the dust, hands clawing at the air, eyes shocked not by death but by surprise. Niko opened his eyes and saw, on a low rise near the well, a villager with a bow, one of the border hunters, not a soldier, a man who had likely never fired at a human before today. His face was pale, his mouth trembling. He met Niko's gaze for a second, then looked away as if ashamed of what he'd done. Niko dropped the spear, suddenly weak. Thaleia reached him then, grabbed him hard, and slapped him once across the cheek. Not a cruel slap, a desperate one. "You disobeyed," she hissed. Niko tried to speak but only sobbed, silent, ugly sobs that made his shoulders shake. Thaleia's eyes burned. Then she pulled him into her chest, held him for a heartbeat, and pushed him back behind the wall. "Stay," she said, softer now, "stay alive." And she ran back to the fire. That small scene, the child, the arrow, the slap and embrace, never appears in military histories. It's too small, too domestic, too human. But I'm telling you, it matters. Because wars are not fought only by the men with shields. Wars are fought by everyone who refuses to let the world collapse. Back in the valley, the enemy began to recover from confusion. A coalition can stumble, but it can also learn, especially when there are leaders who know how to use mass like a weapon. A tall invader chieftain, identified in one account as a man from the highlands, wearing a wolf pelt over bronze, rode forward on a horse and began shouting orders. He had a voice that carried. He was doing what Ariston was doing, but with numbers instead of discipline, trying to give shape to chaos. Ariston saw him. He also saw something worse. The coalition's archers were repositioning. Arrows were not decisive against a tight phalanx at long range, but inside a swirling melee at close angles, arrows find gaps. They strike necks, they strike thighs, they strike faces turned at the wrong time. And now the Spartans were surrounded enough that arrows could come from sides, even from behind. Ariston's mouth tightened. He made another choice, and it was the kind of choice that only a commander with ice in his blood can make. He signaled for the line to compress further, shields tighter, formation deeper. This meant less room to breathe, less room to swing. It meant the Spartans would move slower. But it also meant the wall became harder to puncture with arrows and sudden flanking thrusts. They became, in effect, a moving fortress inside an ocean of men. Menon's numb arm began to fail him. He switched grip awkwardly, compensating. Kyros noticed and began taking more of the spear work, stabbing over Menon's shoulder, trying to keep the pressure off him. "Don't," Menon hissed, voice harsh. Kyros swallowed. "Your arms." "Don't waste your eyes on me," Menon snapped. "Waste them on death." Kyros did as ordered, but the words sank deep. He realized Menon wasn't being cruel. He was teaching him how to survive. You cannot carry someone else's pain and still hold the line. Dorion's group finally drove the raiders back from the huts, leaving bodies in the dust. He looked toward the main fight and saw the Spartan formation now like a knot inside the enemy, turning slowly, grinding. He knew what that meant. They were winning a kind of victory that doesn't look like victory. They were not advancing miles. They were not claiming banners. They were doing something that looks almost like stubbornness, holding in place while the enemy bleeds itself trying to crush them. But Dorion could also see the danger. If the enemy found the knot's rhythm, if they coordinated their pushes, the Spartans could be fixed in place and slowly suffocated. He had to rejoin. He gathered his 20, now 17, then 16 as he counted again, and began forcing his way back toward the main body, cutting through the edges of the melee, calling the Spartan cadence so his men could find him through noise. Some heard and answered. Some did not answer at all. The sun climbed higher and heat began to join the battle. Armor became an oven, breath became harder, blood dried sticky on skin. Flies appeared. Yes, even in the middle of slaughter, flies are always the first to arrive, as if the world is eager to begin consuming what men destroy. Euenos, deeper in the formation, felt his legs shaking from continuous push. His thighs burned, his shoulders ached. In his mind he saw fields back home, soil turned under a plow, the slow, honest work of growing food. He thought, absurdly, of a particular morning when he'd argued with his wife over a broken fence. How small that argument seemed now, how precious. He touched his cuirass again, feeling the cloth inside. He didn't do it for luck. He did it to remember why he was still standing. An enemy spear jabbed in, caught him under the ribs but glanced off armor. Pain flared. He grunted and shoved forward harder, fury suddenly alive in him, not hatred for the invader, but a refusal to be taken from his life like a coin stolen in the street. Ariston, in the heart of the knot, measured time by breaths. He knew they could not fight like this all day. 700 could hold only so long before exhaustion opened cracks, and cracks in a phalanx are like cracks in a dam. He needed a moment that changed the shape of the battle again. He looked for the wolf-pelt chieftain, the one shouting orders. He saw him still mounted, still commanding, still giving the enemy a spine. If the spine broke, the body would collapse. Ariston pointed 2 fingers, sharp, and a small group of Spartans shifted, not breaking formation, but creating a brief corridor inside the knot. This was the most dangerous kind of move, sending men forward in close quarters where one misstep can tear the wall. Kyros saw the gesture and realized with a jolt that Ariston was selecting men for something like an assassination, killing the leader to break the enemy's nerve. Kyros' heart hammered. He wanted to be chosen. He also feared being chosen because desire and fear are twins. Ariston's eyes swept the men Menon, Dorion returning Uinos, others whose names never survived. And then his gaze landed on Kyros for a fraction of a second. Kyros felt as if a hand had gripped his throat. Ariston nodded once. Not encouragement. A command. Kyros stepped forward into the corridor, spear in hand, shield high. Menon's voice rough behind him, don't chase glory. Kyros didn't answer, he couldn't, his mouth had gone dry. Dorion appeared at Kyros' side, blood on his arm, grin gone now. Stay close, Dorion said. If you die, I'll have to do the work. Kyros almost laughed, but no sound came. They advanced 3 steps, 4, pushing through a gap opened by comrades, shields pressed tight. Enemy eyes snapped toward them. Shouts rose, hands reached. Ariston moved with them, not ahead like a hero, but in the center of their small spearhead, making sure they stayed connected to the main body. The wolf-pelt chieftain saw the threat and barked an order. His guards surged. For a moment, time narrowed. Kyros saw the horse's nostrils flaring, saw the chieftain's jaw set, saw sunlight flash on a raised blade. He also saw, impossibly, Thaleia's face in his mind, though he had barely spoken to her in his life. Not because he loved her, because she represented what was behind them, the world that would be violated if they failed. He lunged. His spear struck a guard's shield, slid, then found a gap at the man's neck. The guard went down, choking. Dorion stabbed another. Ariston drove forward with brutal economy, his movements stripped of everything but necessity. They reached the horses. The chieftain swung down with his sword, aiming for Ariston's head. Ariston lifted his shield. The blade bit into bronze, stuck for a heartbeat. Kyros, without thinking, thrust upward. The spearpoint caught the horse in the chest. The animal screamed and reared, throwing the chieftain off balance. In that instant, Dorion's spear took the chieftain low in the belly. The wolf-pelt man's face changed, rage collapsing into shock. He fell, and the sound that came from the invaders was not just anger. It was uncertainty. Because leadership is a story an army tells itself. Kill the storyteller, and suddenly everyone forgets what the next line is supposed to be. Ariston did not let them linger. Back, he shouted. They retreated into the knot, pulling with them the brief, violent success like a stolen torch. The corridor closed, shields overlapped again. And the enemy's spine began to wobble. But victory, even here, was not clean. On the retreat, an enemy blade caught Dorion's side under the ribs. It wasn't deep, but it was enough. Dorion's breath hitched. His face went gray for a second. Kyros grabbed Dorion's shoulder, half carrying him back into formation. Dorion gritted his teeth. Don't you dare, he rasped. Don't I dare what? Don't get attached, Dorion said, and then, because even wounded he couldn't resist, he added, it makes you slow. Kyros' eyes stung with something that wasn't sweat. He shoved Dorion back into place and faced forward again. Now the enemy began to break in pockets. Not running yet, not a rout. But the cohesion, the belief that they were one unstoppable mass, was cracking. Men began to look over shoulders more often. Orders contradicted each other. Some contingents paused, waiting for signals that never came. And through that crack, the Spartans pressed. Not with a new charge they had already charged. This was the same charge, extended, transformed into a grinding dominance, a forward motion that never truly stopped, even when it slowed. That is how one charge becomes possible in memory, because the Spartans never gave the enemy the relief of a pause. They did not reset. They did not back away and start again. They kept the pressure continuous until the enemy's mind broke. From the ridge near the village, Thaleia saw the enemy's nearest groups begin to drift backward. Oh, she didn't cheer. She knew better than to celebrate too early. She only tightened her grip on a bucket and whispered, not to any god in particular but to the air itself, "Hold." Niko, behind the wall, watched the Spartan not still moving, still alive, and in his chest a strange new feeling formed, something between awe and terror. He realized that courage wasn't loud. Courage was a line that didn't open. And somewhere inside the knot, Ariston began preparing the next and final shape of this battle, the moment that would turn cracking into collapse and collapse into legend. Because breaking an army is one thing, making it run is another. And if 40,000 ran, they would trample each other to do it. That more than spearwork is how huge numbers die. Ariston looked at the battlefield and measured the enemy's fear like a man feeling for wind before setting a sail. Then he spoke to his officers, low but urgent. "We will strike the sound," he said. They didn't understand at first. Ariston's eyes narrowed, the horns, the drums, the men who keep them together. He meant cut the enemy's heartbeat out. And in the next movement, the Spartans would do something so audacious that later storytellers would compress it into a single sentence. 700 crushed 40,000 in one charge, because no one wants to spend breath explaining how terror is engineered. But we will spend the breaths, because this is where it turns from battle into catastrophe. There is a sound an army makes when it still believes in itself. It's not the shouting. Shouting can be faked. Any frightened man can scream. It's the rhythm underneath, the steady drum, the horns answering in patterns, the calls of officers being repeated down a line like a prayer. Those sounds turn panic into purpose. They make men feel they are part of something larger, and feeling part of something larger is what keeps a man from running. Ariston understood that. So when he said, "We will strike the sound," he wasn't talking about music. He was talking about the enemy's nervous system. Inside the Spartan knot, the veterans listened. Menon's eyes were half-lidded now, not from sleep but from pain. His left arm hung heavier. His shield still held, but the arm behind it was tiring. He didn't complain again. Spartans rarely did. The closest Menon came to admitting weakness was a tightness at the corners of his mouth and the way his breathing rasped. Dorion, blood seeping at his side, had stuffed cloth into the wound. His grin was gone, replaced by a focused stare. He kept his right arm moving, stabbing when openings came, but each thrust cost him more than the last. Euenos could taste iron in his mouth, blood, maybe his own from a bitten tongue, maybe someone else's spatter. He stopped thinking in sentences. He thought in sensations: push, hold, breathe, don't fall. Kyros felt older than he'd been at dawn, not wiser, older, like the battle was scraping youth off him in layers. Ariston waited for the right instant, the way a fisherman waits for the tug that means the hook has set. He watched the enemy's movements through gaps between helmets and shields. He listened. Yes, listened, because even in chaos, a commander with experience can hear when a larger rhythm is faltering. The enemy horn sounded again, a long note that tried to gather the scattered contingents. It came from somewhere slightly left of Ariston's front, close enough to be reached, far enough to be dangerous. Ariston leaned to the man nearest him, a veteran named Esthenel, one of those names that appears only once, but appears at exactly the point where a man must have done something worth noting. Esthenel, Ariston said, "Take 10, find the horn." 10 men's. In a battle like this, 10 men sent away is like cutting fingers off your own hand and hopping you can still grip. Esthenel's eyes flicked to the knot around him and back to Ariston. He didn't argue. He just nodded once and selected his 10 men who still had breath, men whose arms still responded. Kyros felt himself lean forward unconsciously, wanting to be part of it. Ariston didn't look at him this time. Ariston's attention was already elsewhere, calculating. Esthenel's 10 slipped out of the knot on the left flank in a tight little column, shields high. It wasn't a heroic break. It was stealth inside violence. They moved like a fish darting out from a school, trusting the school to close behind them. The Spartans around them tightened formation to seal the gap instantly. Menon's shield edge overlapped the next man's more deeply. Kyros stepped in behind, filling the space with his body, his fear, his will. The enemy noticed the movement. A few invaders shouted, pointing. Others surged to intercept, eager for a clear target. The thing about a small detachment is that it draws attention. In a sea of chaos, it becomes a visible thread. Ariston did not reinforce them. That was the cruelty of command. If you keep feeding men into an exposed movement, you weaken your core and risk everything. You have to accept that the 10 may be sacrificed for the hundreds. The horn sounded again, shorter this time, more urgent. Esthenel's 10 crashed into a knot of enemy skirmishers and pushed through with brutal speed. Spears went in and out quick, almost stabbing motions rather than full thrusts. Shields slammed, bodies fell. They were close now. The horn-bearer stood on a low rock beside two guards, blowing until his cheeks bulged. He was not a warrior in the same way. He carried a short blade, yes, but his main weapon was the sound itself. Esthenel saw him, and the invaders saw Esthenel. A guard stepped forward with a heavy axe, swinging in a wide arc meant to smash shield and skull together. Esthenel ducked the blow, stepped inside the arc and drove his spear into the guard's gut. The man collapsed, axe slipping from his fingers. Another guard lunged with a spear. One of Esthenel's men took it in the shoulder and went down, not dead, screaming. The scream was swallowed, but not completely. Esthenel didn't stop, he couldn't. He reached the horn-bearers. The horn-bearer tried to back away, still blowing, still trying to keep the rhythm alive. Esthenel slammed his shield into the man's face, and the horn note broke off mid-breath like a snapped string. Then Esthenel's sword, short, practical, flashed once. The horn fell from the man's hand and rolled down the rock. For one heartbeat, the battlefield went strangely quiet in that direction, not silent, but missing something essential. Like a song continuing after the drum has stopped, suddenly exposed and wrong. Then, from the enemy line, a different horn tried to answer. Ariston heard it. He turned his head slightly. Again, he said, "Find that one." This was not a single lucky strike, it was a method. Esthenel's remaining men tried to pull back toward the Spartan knot, but now they were marked. Enemy fighters surged toward them, enraged. The 10 had become the center of a storm. 2 Spartans fell, a third was dragged down, a fourth fought with his back against a stone, stabbing downward until a blade took him in the neck. Esthenel himself took a spearpoint through the thigh. He staggered, teeth clenched. He looked back toward Ariston's knot. For a moment, their eyes met across bodies. Ariston's face did not change. It couldn't. If a commander lets grief show, he gives grief permission to spread. But Ariston lifted his spear in a small salute, barely visible but visible enough. Esthenel understood. He nodded once. And then he turned away from the knot and charged into the enemy again, not to survive, but to buy seconds, to keep the enemy occupied, to make sure no new horn could be sounded clearly. That is what the best soldiers do when they are truly veteran. They don't die by accident. They spend their death like coin. The Spartan knot held, but it was taking damage now in ways numbers do not show. Menon finally let out a sound that was almost a growl as his arm failed. His shield dipped for a fraction of a second. A spear jabbed in, aiming for the gap. Kyros reacted before thinking. He thrust his own shield forward, catching the blow, taking the shock in his shoulder. Pain lit up his collarbone like fire. Menon's eyes flicked to him, a look that might have been approval if Spartans allowed themselves such indulgence. Good, Menon rasped, then quieter, "Now keep doing it." Dorion swayed slightly. Euenos reached an arm behind him and grabbed Dorion's belt, a soldier's trick, anchoring a weakening man so he doesn't collapse and open a hole. Dorion didn't thank him, he just breathed through clenched teeth and kept stabbing. This is one of the ugliest truths of phalanx warfare. You are held upright by other people. Individual heroism is less important than being carried when your legs want to fold. The enemy, deprived of rhythm, began to sound different. Shouting became less coordinated. More men screamed, not war cries, but angry questions. Officers tried to impose order, but their commands were swallowed or contradicted by others. The coalition's different tongues became a problem again. A leader from one contingent gave an order, and another contingent thought it was an insult. Somewhere in the press, two allied invader units collided and began fighting each other. At first it was accidental, shields shoved, tempers flared. Then it became real because once blood is spilled, pride demands more blood. Ariston sensed the crack widening. Now came the part that later storytellers would call the crushing, because it's the part where a huge army begins to kill itself. He shouted for the Spartans to advance, not fast, not a new charge, but a steady forward surge at exactly the moment the enemy's cohesion was weakest. The knot became a rolling walls. They pushed into disorganized clusters, smashing them back, forcing them to compress against other clusters, turning the battlefield into a crowded nightmare where no one had room to swing a sword properly. Men fell not always to Spartan spears, but under their own men's feet. You could hear ribs crack under boots. You could hear a man choking as he was pressed face first into mud and couldn't lift his head. This is what mass warfare becomes when control is lost, a stampede in armor. And it spreads. The first invaders to retreat did not retreat because they were cowards. They retreated because someone behind them shoved, because an allied unit swung into them, because their officer was suddenly missing, because they heard the horn stop and felt in their gut that the gods had turned away. Once a few moved backward, more followed, not in unison like water seeping through cracks. Then it became a flow. Ariston saw it and understood. If he allowed them to retreat in an orderly way, they could regroup, turn, and overwhelm the Spartans with renewed formation. He needed the retreat to become a rout. But a rout is dangerous for the victors too. If you chase too far, you stretch and thin. The enemy can turn and cut you down in scattered pieces. So Ariston made another cold choice. He did not chase the retreating edges. He kept driving into the center, focusing on widening the panic there, because panic in the center infects everything around it. From the ridge near the village, Thaleia saw movement she hadn't seen earlier, invaders no longer surging forward but stumbling back. Some ran, some turned to shout at their comrades, some threw down shields to run faster. The fire near the hut had been reduced to smoking timbers, the bucket chain had worked. Thaleia's hands were raw, her arms trembling. She watched the valley and felt something she hated failing: hope. Hope is dangerous in war, hope makes you careless. She forced herself to keep working, to keep directing villagers to douse embers, because she knew if the Spartans failed at the last moment, the invaders' rage would be worse. Niko stared wide-eyed at the enemy running. He didn't understand the strategy, but he understood the shift in the air, the way predators sound when they've become prey. He whispered almost to himself, "They're leaving." Thaleia didn't answer, she couldn't let herself believe it yet. On the field, Dorion saw the enemy beginning to peel away, and something like laughter bubbled in his throat, then turned into a cough of pain as his wound pulled. He glanced at Kyros. "Don't look so surprised," he rasped. "Big things fall hard." Kyros's face was streaked with sweat and blood that wasn't his. "Are we winning?" Dorion's eyes narrowed. "We're not dead yet," he said. "That's all you ever count until the sun goes down." Menon, hearing them, barked a short laugh that turned into a grimace. "Listen to him," he said, "a poet." Then Menon's nose buckled slightly. Kyros reached for him. Menon slapped his hand away. "Don't," he growled, "not yet." But Kyros saw it. Menon's arm was nearly useless now, his breathing wet. Something internal, maybe a cracked rib, maybe a punctured lung, was failing. Veterans can be indestructible right up until they are. Ariston was still pushing. And now the enemy tried one final response. A concentrated push from a fresh contingent on the Spartan rear flank, men who had not yet engaged fully, trying to strike the Spartans while they were committed forward. This was the danger of being a knot inside an army. You can be attacked from directions you cannot see. The fresh contingent slammed into the Spartan rear. Shields jolted, men stumbled, a gap threatened to open. For a moment, only a moment, the entire battle teetered. And in that moment, Menon made a decision. He stepped out of his place. A Spartan stepping out of the line is almost unthinkable. It's how you die, it's how you endanger others. But Menon wasn't leaving to run. He was leaving to plug the rear. With his bad arm, he couldn't hold the front, but he could still stand, he could still be weight. He shoved himself into the rear gap, raised his shield with both hands, and took the brunt of the fresh contingent's first impact. The blow drove him backward, he held. A second blow came, his shield edge cracked, he held. A third blow struck. He made a choking sound, and Kyros realized with horror that Menon's internal injury had given way. Blood spilled from Menon's mouth. Still he held. Kyros screamed an uncontrolled sound finally, and tried to push in behind him. Menon turned his head slightly, eyes sharp even now. "Stay," he rasped, "in the wall." And Kyros obeyed because Menon's obedience was contagious. Uinos, Dorion, others, without orders, shifted pressure, forming a new rear-facing brace. The Spartan knot became, for a crucial span of heartbeats, a two-faced wall, one side still pushing forward into panic, the other side resisting the fresh contingent's attempt to cut them open. Ariston felt the rear hit and knew exactly what was happening. He did not turn around. That is a terrifying thing to understand about command. Sometimes you cannot look at the people dying behind you, because the moment you turn, you lose the battle in front of you and then everyone dies anyway. Instead, Ariston shouted forward, voice like iron. "Now!" The Spartans surged one more time into the enemy's center. A sudden coordinated shove that sent already panicked invaders stumbling over each other. It was not pretty. It was not noble. It was crushing. Men fell, men were trampled. Men dropped weapons and clawed at comrades to get away. The retreat became a run. The run became a rout. And when 40,000 men try to flee through the same spaces they advanced through, the earth itself becomes an enemy. Ditches, rocks, carts, fallen bodies, everything turns into a trap. Thousands can die without a Spartan spear touching them again. That is why people later said in astonishment that a small force crushed a huge one, because they watched the huge one destroy itself once it stopped believing in its own shape. But the Spartans paid for that victory in flesh. Menon's shield finally slipped from his hands. He fell to one knee, then the other. The rear pressure eased slightly as the fresh contingent began to waver, seeing the rout spreading. Kyros caught Menon as he fell backward. Menon's head lolled against Kyros's shoulder. His eyes found Kyros's for a second. Menon tried to speak, only blood came. Kyros pressed his forehead to Menon's temple, a gesture too intimate for Spartan training, but war breaks rules. "Stay with me," Kyros whispered. Menon's lips moved again, a sound like breath. Then his eyes went unfocused. Kyros stiffened, as if refusing to accept the weight going limp in his arms. Then he swallowed hard, and because the wall still needed him, he lowered Menon carefully behind the formation, where the wounded and dead were collecting like driftwood. Dorion saw Kyros do it and his jaw tightened. He didn't comment. He just placed his hand briefly on Kyros's shoulder. One squeeze, quick, the closest thing to comfort a Spartan veteran would allow himself. Ariston finally allowed the knot to slow. Not stop, slow. He looked around and saw what he had achieved. The enemy center was collapsing outward, men streaming away, officers shouting into emptiness, banners falling. The Spartan formation, battered and bleeding, still held its shape. 700 had not killed 40,000 man-to-man. But they had broken 40,000. They had turned an invasion into a disaster. And in the language of survivors, disaster becomes crushed. From the village, Thaleia watched the rout spread like a sickness through the invaders. She covered her mouth with her hand, not to hide tears, but to keep from making any sound that might tempt fate. Niko, trembling, said they did it. Thaleia's eyes stayed on the battlefield, searching for the crest she had seen earlier. Not yet, she murmured, not yet. Because the last danger in any rout is the wounded pride of those who remain. A cornered animal is most lethal when it realizes it is losing. And there were still invaders near enough to kill. Ariston knew it too. He raised his spear again, not in triumph but in warning. "Hold," he shouted, "hold the lines." The veterans tightened, refusing to become a mob-chasing victory. They had learned long ago that discipline wins battles, and indiscipline throws them away at the end. But as they held, as they watched the enemy flee, another sound rose, different from horns, different from drums. A wailings, not from the invaders, from somewhere within the Spartan ranks. A wounded man crying out for water, for his mother, for anyone. War always ends up there, no matter how heroic the beginning. And Ariston, standing amid victory, looked for the cost. Because when the shouting stops, commanders finally count. And what he counted, who was missing, who was lying too still, would change him. After the rout begins, people think the battle is over. Well, it is. A battle ends in layers. First, the enemy's courage breaks, then their formation breaks. Then, if you are fortunate, their will to return breaks too. And only after that, only when the last arrow has fallen and the last man has stopped pretending he's still brave, does the real accounting begin. Ariston held his line until the enemy was far enough away that the fleeing mass could not suddenly turn into a coordinated counterattack. Only then did he allow the knot to loosen. Breathe, he ordered, and it sounded strange, like telling drowning men to inhale. The Spartans lowered shields slightly, some leaned on spear shafts. A few sat down where they stood because their legs no longer trusted them. No one cheered, not yet. Cheering in that moment would have felt like laughing at a corpse. The valley had changed. Where there had been a living, moving host of invaders, there were now scattered groups sprinting away in every direction, dropping gear to run faster, colliding and separating like frightened animals. And between them and the Spartan line lay the aftermath. Broken spears, bent shields, discarded helmets and bodies, too many bodies, some still moving, some already still. It smelled like blood and sweat and dust and animal waste and smoke from the village. It smelled like the world's underside. Ariston walked along the line, checking men the way a farmer checks posts after a storm. His face was a mask, but his eyes weren't empty. They were sharp, searching. He stopped beside Dorion. Dorion stood upright, but barely. His tunic was soaked at the side where the blade had opened him. His hand shook when he tried to adjust his grip. Ariston looked at the wound without asking permission. How deep? Dorion tried to shrug and regretted it instantly. Deep enough to be interesting, he said, voice dry. Ariston's gaze didn't soften, but it steadied. You will sit, he said. Dorion opened his mouth, Spartans hate being told they're wounded, but Ariston cut him off with a slight tilt of his head. That's an order, Ariston said, and Dorion obeyed, sinking onto a rock with a hiss. Ariston moved on. He found Kyros near the rear, kneeling beside Menon's body. Kyros's hands were red to the wrist. He kept rubbing them together as if he could scrape the blood off with friction alone. His eyes were fixed on Menon's face like he expected the dead man to scold him for kneeling. Menon's mouth was half open. Dried blood darkened his lips. His expression, strangely, was not fear. It was fatigue. The fatigue of someone who had finished his last duty and finally allowed himself to stop. Ariston crouched. The movement was careful. Commanders learn to crouch carefully in a field full of unseen blades and broken bones. He looked at Menon for a moment, then at Kyros. Kyros swallowed. His throat worked like he was forcing something down. He held, Kyros said, it came out hoarse. He held the rear. Ariston nodded once, I saw. Kyros's eyes flared. Then why, he stopped himself. He didn't know what he was asking, why Menon had to die, why any of them had to. Ariston's voice stayed low. Because you are alive, he said. Kyros stared, confused, angry. Ariston held his gaze. He bought that, Ariston said, and he tapped Kyros's chest with 2 fingers, gentle for a Spartan, almost unbearable in its restraint. Do not spend it cheaply. Kyros's jaw trembled. He wanted to say something noble, something worthy of Menon's death. All he managed was, yes. Ariston stood, then surprised Kyros by reaching down and adjusting Menon's cloak over his shoulder, covering him more fully. It wasn't ceremonial. It was practical. It was also, in its Spartan way, love, protecting a comrade's body from flies, from sun, from indignity. Ariston walked on. The wounded began to make themselves known now. In the fight, pain is often delayed by adrenaline, by fury, by focus. When the danger fades, the body collects its debts. A man sat with a spear still through his calf, staring at it as if it belonged to someone else. Another clutched his stomach and rocked, breathing in short sobs. A third walked aimlessly, helmet gone, hair matted with blood, eyes blank, the look of a mind that has stepped away to avoid breaking. Euenos found himself suddenly shaking so hard his teeth clicked. He sank down and pressed his forehead to his shield, not praying, not thinking, just trying to keep his insides from spilling out through his mouth. His hand went to his cuirass again, to that scrap of weaving. He pulled it out for the first time. It was a small piece of cloth, blue and white, edges frayed, ordinary, the kind of thing someone might use to patch a sleeve. He held it like it was priceless. His wife's hands had made it. Her hands had moved back and forth in a warm room while he was here, pushing against a wall of men. Euenos' shoulders shook. Tears came, silent, hot, humiliating. No one mocked him. Veterans don't mock that. They've earned the right to fall apart for a moment. Near the village, Thaleia finally allowed herself to stop running. The last embers had been crushed. Smoke drifted low, stinging eyes, buckets lay overturned. People stood with hands on knees, panting like animals. Then Thaleia looked out at the valley again. The invaders were fleeing, yes. But there were still small groups near enough to be dangerous. Men who hadn't run, men who were angry, men who might decide to take revenge on the village because they could no longer win the battle. Dorion's detachment, what remained of it, had formed a rough screen near the huts. They were not fighting now, but they were watching. They had the posture of wolves guarding a wounded pack. Thaleia saw Dorion sit and grimace in pain. She saw him wave away help, stubborn. She saw Kyros kneeling by the dead, and though she didn't know his name, she recognized that posture too. The posture of someone who has just met loss face to face. And she searched for Ariston. When she finally saw him, standing amid his men like a pillar that hadn't fallen, her chest tightened. Because victory does not erase the fact that he might still die. Men bleed after battles. Wounds that didn't matter in the fight become fatal later. Thaleia wiped soot from her forehead and started walking toward the edge of the battlefield. Someone tried to stop her. An older woman grabbed her arm. "Thaleia, don't," the woman whispered. "There are still enemies." Thaleia pulled free. "Then I will see them," she said. She walked with a steadiness that wasn't bravery. It was inevitability, like she had decided long ago that fear was not allowed to choose her steps. Niko followed at a distance, disobeying again, quieter this time. As Thaleia approached the Spartan line, a few veterans watched her with guarded expressions. Not suspicion exactly, more like curiosity. Spartan soldiers were trained to treat civilians as background, as something behind them, but border life blurs that separation. These men had eaten her food, drunk her water, slept under roofs her hands maintained. She was not a stranger. Ariston saw her coming. For a moment his face remained commander hard, as if he were still in battle and any softness might invite another attack. Then his eyes changed slightly, not soft, still not soft but human, the kind of change only someone who knows you can notice. He stepped forward to meet her, away from the densest cluster of wounded so the sight and sounds would not swallow their words. Thaleia stopped a few paces from him. Up close, Ariston looked older than he had at dawn. Dust clung to sweat on his cheekbones. There was blood on his forearm, someone else's or his own, she couldn't tell. His shield was scarred like a face that had been punched repeatedly and refused to break. Thaleia's gaze flicked briefly to his hands. She noticed a tremor. "Not fear. Exhaustion. You're still standing," she said. Ariston's mouth twitched. "So are you." Thaleia looked past him to the valley. They ran. "They broke," Ariston corrected. Thaleia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for hours. It sounded like something between a laugh and a sob. Then she remembered she was alive among corpses and her voice hardened again, because you have to harden to keep going. "How many?" she asked. Ariston didn't answer immediately. He glanced back toward his line, toward the wounded, toward where Menon lay covered. Then he said, "Too many." It was the only honest number. Thaleia's eyes narrowed at him, not accusing but demanding. "And the invaders?" Ariston's gaze moved across the field. "They will tell their children a different story," he said, "if they have children." Thaleia nodded slowly. She understood what he meant. There were dead invaders everywhere. Not 40,000 dead, no, but enough that the survivors would carry the memory like a scar. "And if they return?" she asked. Ariston looked at her then, truly looked, as if the battlefield noise faded for a moment and there was only this question. If they return, he said, we will be here or our sons will. Thaleia's throat tightened, and if there are no sons left. Ariston's eyes didn't blink. Then Sparta ends, he said, as if speaking of weather, so we make sure there are sons. Thaleia hated him for that for half a heartbeat, the coldness, the way he spoke about generations like supply lines. Then she realized it wasn't coldness. It was the only way a man like him could carry the weight of what he'd done without collapsing. She reached into her cloak and pulled out the cracked bronze mirror she had given him the night before. I told you, she said, so you remember your faces. Ariston looked at it, the crack caught sunlight and split it. He took it carefully as if it could cut him. I remember, he said. Thaleia's voice softened despite herself. Do you? Ariston's jaw clenched. Then quietly he said, I remember Menon's face. It was the first time he spoke a dead man's name aloud. That mattered. Thaleia felt a sting behind her eyes. She forced it down. Niko approached then, unable to help himself. He stopped near Thaleia's side, eyes wide as he stared at Ariston like at a myth that breathes. Ariston noticed the strip of cloak still tied around the boy's wrist. You ran? Ariston asked. Niko swallowed, no. Thaleia made a small sound, half warning. Niko blurted, I tried to, he pointed vaguely toward the village, but someone shot him. Ariston's gaze flicked to the hunters near the well. He nodded once, acknowledging the unseen act. Then he looked back at Niko. You lived, Ariston said. Niko nodded, ashamed and proud at the same time. Ariston's voice lowered. Then you will remember what you saw, he said. Not the shouting, not the running, the holding. Niko's eyes filled, he nodded again. Thaleia watched the exchange and felt something dangerous bloom in her chest, something she hadn't allowed herself since her husband died. Not just gratitude. Affection. The kind of affection that can become love if you feed it. She didn't feed it, not yet. Love in wartime is a luxury that can turn into a knife. Still, she said, come to the house, and the words came out more personal than she intended. You and your men, the wounded. Ariston hesitated. He looked toward the field again, toward scattered invaders, toward the possibility of another attack. Thaleia anticipated his refusal and added, practical, almost harsh. If you keep them out here, infection will kill more than spears. I have linen, oil, water, I have hands. Ariston studied her for a moment, then nodded once. Dorions, he called. Dorion looked up from his rock, face pale. Yes. Take the wounded to Thaleia's house, Ariston ordered. Set guards, no one drinks until I say. Dorion's mouth twitched. Cruel, he muttered, but he began shouting orders. Men began moving, supporting each other, half carrying those who couldn't walk. Kyros stood slowly, wiping his hands on the dirt because blood doesn't come off easily. He looked back at Menon's body, then at Ariston. What about him? Kyros asked, voice tight. Ariston looked at Menon, then he said, we take our dead and there was steel in it. All we can. Sparta could be ruthless, but it was not careless with its own. As the veterans began to move toward the village in a weary procession, the battlefield behind them remained littered with the broken evidence of the day. The invaders' main mass was gone now, fleeing into hills and distance. Yet Ariston didn't relax. Because a fleeing enemy can become a raiding enemy, and raiders like to circle back for easy kills. He posted pickets, he ordered scouts, he sent runners to nearby towns. And then at last he allowed himself one private moment. He stood alone for a breath on the ridge and looked down at where the charge had begun. 700. Not boys. Veterans. He could name more faces now that were missing than any commander should have to. He closed his eyes briefly, and in his mind he heard again the horn stopping mid-note, the sound of a huge army losing its story. He opened his eyes. Thaleia's house waited, wounded waited, the next choices waited. Victory was not an ending. It was a new beginning built on bodies. And the most dangerous part of the story was still ahead, because once the battle is won, people start asking what it meant. And what it meant could tear a community apart just as surely as an invader's blade. Thaleia's house was not large, but it was built the way border houses are built, like a stubborn fist. Stone walls thick enough to keep heat in winter and arrows out in summer. A low doorway that forced even tall men to bow their heads to enter. A single main room that smelled of smoke, dried herbs, and the faint sourness of old wine spilled into wood. By midday it became a hospital. Not the clean, gentle kind people like to imagine in civilized stories. This was a place of hard triage, who can be saved, who will die no matter what you do, who can be made comfortable, who must be silenced because their screaming will unravel the rest. Thaleia took control without announcing it. She didn't ask permission from Ariston or Dorion. She simply started assigning tasks like a commander assigning ranks. You, she said to a young villager, boil water, don't stop. You, to an old woman, tear linen into strips. And you, to Niko, hold this bowl. If you spill it, I'll make you drink the dirt. Niko's hands trembled, yes. The veterans came in carrying their wounded like burdens they refused to drop. They tried not to look at the floor where blood smeared into dark tracks. They tried not to listen to the sounds coming from inside. Groans, prayers, teeth grinding, someone whispering, no, 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 as if repetition could change fate. Dorion was carried in last. He protested, of course he did, until his legs buckled and two men caught him. Put me down, he hissed, trying to be the brave fool. Thaleia met him at the threshold, eyes narrowing. You're bleeding on my floor, she said. Dorion's mouth twitched, then I'll pay for the wine twice. Thaleia pointed at a bench. Sit. Dorion sat because even Dorion recognized a greater authority when he saw it. Ariston entered after, not carried, not helped. He moved stiffly, and only someone watching closely would notice how careful he was not to put full weight on his left side. Thaleia noticed. Her eyes flicked to his ribs. You're hurt. Ariston's answer was automatic. No. Thaleia stepped closer, close enough that he could smell smoke in her hair, close enough that the old intimacy of border life broke the formal distance soldiers like to keep. She reached out, not touching him yet, and said, Spartans lie badly. A few nearby veterans looked away, pretending not to hear. Ariston's jaw tightened. It's nothing. Thaleia didn't argue in words. She took the cracked bronze mirror from where it lay and held it up, not for vanity, but for inspection. Look, she said. Ariston glanced and saw it, a thin line of blood at his temple he hadn't noticed and his left cheek swollen. Then, as he shifted, a grimace flickered at the corner of his mouth, his ribs. Thaleia lowered the mirror. Sit, she repeated, and this time it wasn't a request. Ariston hesitated for half a heartbeat, Spartan pride wrestling with necessity. Then he sat on a low stool near the wall. The room felt for a moment like a different kind of battlefield. Here the enemy was time and infection and shock. Here courage was holding still while someone sewed you, not pushing forward with a spear. Kyros arrived with two wounded men, one limping, one half-dragged. Kyros's face was pale under the grime. His eyes kept darting to corners as if expecting the enemy to burst in through smoke. Thaleia saw that look and understood it instantly. She pointed at him, you wash. Kyros blinked, I'm fine. Thaleia's voice sharpened. You're not fine, you're alive. Wash, or you'll touch a wound with those hands and kill someone you don't mean to. Kyros looked down at his hands, red caked, not fully his own anymore. He swallowed, then he nodded and went to the basin. As he scrubbed, the water turned pink. Then darker, then pink again. He scrubbed until his knuckles stung. It didn't make him cleanse. It only reminded him he could feel pain, and feeling pain meant he was still here. Uinos came in quietly with another wounded veteran. Uinos' eyes were red-rimmed, not from smoke. He kept his scrap of weaving tucked back under his cuirass as if he'd shown weakness once and would not again. He set the wounded man down and started to turn away, as if his role was finished. Thaleia stopped him with a word, stay. Uinos froze, I'm not a healer. No, Thaleia said, your hands, I need hands. Uinos looked at the chaos, the blood, the linen, the groaning men, and something in him resisted. Not fear, a kind of moral exhaustion, the part of him that had already given everything outside and couldn't imagine giving more inside. Thaleia's eyes held his. If you can push a shield, she said, you can hold a man down while I stitch him. Euenos inhaled slow, then he nodded once and stepped forward. Ariston watched all this silent. He watched the way Thaleia moved through bodies without flinching. He watched the way villagers obeyed her. He watched the way even Spartans, men trained to obey only Spartan command, shifted when she spoke. Power, he realized, is not always rank. Sometimes it is competence. Sometimes it is love wearing a hard face. A wounded veteran cried out as Thaleia pressed oil into a cut. "Hold him," Thaleia snapped, and two men pinned the wounded man's shoulders. Kyros, passing by with clean water, hesitated, then stepped in and held a wrist. The wounded man sobbed, "Please, please." Kyros said without thinking, "Breathe, like this," and he breathed slowly, forcing rhythm into chaos. The wounded man's sobbing slowed. Kyros realized with a jolt that he had just done what Menon had done for him, turned fear into order. That was how veterans are made. Dorion sat on the bench, sweat beading on his brow, his wound throbbed. He watched Thaleia work, then glanced at Ariston. "If you die here," Dorion muttered, "I'll be very angry." Ariston's voice was flat, "Try not to be sentimental." Dorion's laugh came out as a hiss. "I'm not sentimental," he said. "I'm practical, you owe me wine." Thaleia shot Dorion a look. "You're not drinking." Dorion stared at her, offended as if she'd confiscated his sword. "I fought for it." "You bled for it," she corrected. "Now you heal for it." Dorion opened his mouth to argue and then, surprisingly, closed it. He was too tired to fight this battle. Outside, the village buzzed with the aftermath. Some people began scavenging abandoned invader gear left near the outskirts, helmets, knives, packs. Others prayed, others vomited. Children cried because adults cried. And over it all hung a new and dangerous question: what now? Because victory did not mean safety. The coalition might be broken, but its survivors could regroup, bring new forces, return with vengeance. Or worse, nearby towns might hear that the border settlement had repelled an invasion and decide it was now rich with plunder. Good news travels fast, so does greed. Ariston sent scouts immediately, two veterans he trusted, light on their feet despite age. He also sent Niko with a message to a neighboring outpost, because a boy can sometimes move faster and draw less attention than a soldier. Thaleia objected at once. "No." Ariston looked at her. "He knows the paths." Thaleia's eyes flashed. "He's a child." Ariston's voice stayed calm. "Children live on this border too," he said. Thaleia's jaw tightened. She hated that he was right. Niko, hearing his name, stood straighter, trying to look older. "I can go," he said, voice cracking. "I know the dry creek bed." Thaleia stared at him for a long moment, seeing his dead father in the set of his shoulders, seeing how quickly war steals childhood. She crouched in front of him and grabbed his face between her hands, hard, urgent, like she was imprinting herself into him. "Listen," she said, "if you see anyone you hide, you do not play hero, you do not." Niko nodded rapidly. "I hide, I runs." Thaleia's voice dropped. "And you come back." Niko swallowed. "I come back." Ariston watched the exchange and felt a small, unfamiliar pinch somewhere in his chest. Not guilt, not softness. Recognition. This was what he was protecting. He thought of Sparta's training fields, of boys made hard early, of affection treated as weakness. And yet here affection had produced something he needed, a messenger brave enough to move, careful enough to survive. Niko left with the message tied inside his tunic. Inside the house, Thaleia finally turned to Ariston again. "Your ribs," she said. Ariston's eyes narrowed. "I can breathe." "So can a dying man," Thaleia replied. Before he could protest, she pressed her fingers lightly along his side. Ariston's breath caught despite himself. Thaleia's expression changed, professional now. Bruised, she decided, maybe cracked, not pierced or you'd be coughing blood. Good. Ariston stared at her. "Good," he repeated as if the word tasted strange. Thaleia moved away to another wounded man, then said over her shoulder, "You will rest." Ariston's voice was low, almost bitter. "Rest is for after." Thaleia didn't turn. "After doesn't come," she said, "if you refuse rest now." Silence hung between them. Dorion watched, amused despite pain. He leaned toward Kyros and whispered, "She scares him." Kyros whispered back, "Everyone scares him." Dorion's eyes glittered. No, he said, she scares him in a useful way. Kyros didn't understand, but the tone made his stomach tighten, as if he'd overheard something intimate. As the afternoon wore on, the wounded were stabilized, some were saved, some weren't. One young veteran, barely more than 20, died with his head in Uinos' lap, eyes wide, whispering a mother's name. Uinos held him and felt the life leave like warmth draining from a stone left in snow. Uinos didn't cry this time. He had no tears left. He just stared at the wall, jaw clenched, and promised himself silently that if he survived, he would never again complain about broken fences. Kyros stepped outside for air. The sun was lower now, the light slanting orange across the valley. The battlefield looked almost peaceful at a distance, like a field after harvest, except the stalks were bodies. Kyros leaned against the wall and retched. Nothing came out. His stomach was empty, but the motion kept happening. He heard footsteps and turned. Ariston stood behind him, quiet. Kyros wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist, ashamed. Ariston's voice was low. It's normal. Kyros blinked. Normal. Ariston nodded slightly. If you feel nothing, then you're dead already, he said. Kyros stared at him, shocked by the honesty. Ariston looked out at the valley. They will call it one charge, he said, almost to himself. Kyros frowned. What? Ariston's gaze stayed distant. People like simple stories. 700 crushed 40,000 in a single charge. He said the numbers like stones. It will sound clean to them. Kyros swallowed. Was it not? Ariston's mouth tightened. It was ours, he said. It was holding, turning, cutting horns, men dying without applause. Kyros looked back toward the house, toward Menon's covered body. Menon. Ariston's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in a kind of internal bracing. Menon will not be in the story, he said. Kyros's face flushed. He should be. Ariston looked at him sharply. Then remember him, Ariston said. You remember, that is how men survive death. Kyros's eyes stung. I will. Ariston nodded once and started to walk away. Kyros called after him almost without meaning to. Why did you do it? Ariston stopped. He didn't turn immediately. When he did, his face was unreadable in the slanting light. Because if we didn't, he said, they would have come through, and then Thaleia would have been dead and Niko and your border would have been ash. Kyros swallowed hard. Ariston added, quieter, and because Sparta sent us, and sometimes you don't get to choose the shape of your duty. Then he walked back into the house, into smoke and groans and linen and stubborn life. And Kyros stood outside, watching the sunset over a valley that would be remembered as a miracle by those who wanted miracles, and as a massacre by those who had bled in it. In the distance, a small figure moved along the dry creek bed, Niko, returning or still going, a dot in a world that suddenly demanded too much of a child. The night was coming. And night, after a battle, is when the living begin to fear again, because darkness hides survivors, hides revenge, hides the truth that victory does not guarantee tomorrow. Night after a battle is never quiet. Even when the shouting stops, sound remains like heat in stone after sunset. There are the low moans of men whose wounds have begun to throb with the slow insistence of pain. There is the crackle of small fires where villagers boil water and burn bloody rags. There is the occasional sharp cry when a stitch bites too deep or when someone turns a body and discovers the face is a friend. And there is the silence between those sounds, the kind of silence that makes a person listen too hard, imagining footsteps that aren't there. Thaleia's house glowed dimly from within, lamplight leaking through cracks in shutters. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and iron. Thaleia worked until her hands cramped. She had a rhythm now, clean, bind, stitch, whisper a command, move on. Her face stayed composed, but her eyes betrayed her when she thought no one was looking. Sometimes her gaze drifted toward the door as if she expected the invaders to return in the dark, as if she believed the day's victory was only a pause. Uinos sat near the wall, holding a wounded man's shoulders when Thaleia needed leverage. He hadn't spoken much since the young veteran died in his lap. His jaw remained clenched, a muscle twitching occasionally like a trapped animal. Kyros moved among the wounded with water, following Thaleia's short orders without argument. Something had settled in him, not peace, not confidence, a grim competence, the kind men earn too early. Dorion lay on a pallet now, finally forced down by blood loss and Thaleia's threats. His eyes were open, watching the rafters. Every breath pulled at his wound. "You'll live," Thaleia said without looking at him. Dorion's lips moved. "You sound disappointed." Thaleia snorted, "If you die, who will pay for my wine?" Dorion tried to laugh. It became a cough that made his whole body tense. He swallowed a groan and muttered, "I'll haunt your cups." Across the room, Ariston sat with his back against stone, cloak pulled around his shoulders. He wasn't sleeping. Commanders rarely sleep when they can still smell danger. He listened, not to the wounded, not to Dorion's jokes. To the night outside. He had posted guards, pairs at the edges of the village, a rotating watch, men ordered to keep their eyes open even if their bodies begged to fold. He'd sent scouts into the dark, men who moved like shadows across familiar terrain. Still, Ariston knew how the defeated think. A rooted army doesn't always flee forever. Sometimes it circles back in small groups, not to win but to hurt, to prove to themselves they are still dangerous, to take a few lives to soothe their shame. And shame is a violent fuel. Near midnight, a faint tap came at the door. Every conversation in the room died instantly. Thaleia straightened, cloth in hand. Kyros' body tensed as if he'd been struck. Euenos' hand went to a knife he hadn't realized he was holding. Ariston's head turned slightly. "Who?" he called. A voice answered, thin, breathless, unmistakably young. "It's me," Niko said. "It's Niko." Thaleia moved first, crossing the room in 3 long strides and yanking the door open. Niko stood on the threshold, covered in dust, panting. His eyes were wide and bright in lamplight. He looked proud and terrified, like a boy who has done something too big and is only now realizing the cost of failing. Thaleia grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him once, hard. "You came back," she said. Niko nodded quickly. "I came back." Thaleia's grip tightened, and then, in a motion almost too fast to be seen, she pulled him into her chest and held him there. Her face pressed into his hair, and for a second her mask slipped completely, pure relief, raw as an exposed nerve. Then she released him and slapped his shoulder, not cruel, not gentle. "Inside," she ordered, "now tell." Niko entered, eyes flicking to the wounded, to the blood, to Ariston. He swallowed. "I reached the outpost," he said. "They're sending men, not many, 20, maybe 30. They said the main force is far." Ariston's face remained still, but his eyes sharpened. "How long?" Niko frowned, thinking, "Before dawn if they don't get lost." Ariston nodded once. Reinforcements that small would not change a full invasion, but they could secure the village, escort wounded, send word farther. In war, even small help can be the difference between surviving the next day or being finished off. Thaleia said, "Did you see anyone?" Niko hesitated. The hesitation was answer enough. Ariston leaned forward slightly. "Speak." Niko's voice lowered. "2 men," he said. "Invaders, they were hiding near the olive trees by the creek. I saw them before they saw me." Thaleia's face tightened. "Did they follow you?" Niko shook his head rapidly. "No, I crawled through the rocks like you told me." Ariston stood, slow because of his ribs, and moved to the door. "Where are your sentries?" Thaleia asked sharply. Ariston didn't answer her question directly. "Kyros," he said. Kyros looked up instantly. "Yes." "2 men with me," Ariston ordered. "Quiet." Kyros hesitated only long enough to glance at Thaleia, as if seeking permission or blessing. Thaleia's eyes met his. "Come back," she said, words she had given Niko, now given to a Spartan soldier. Kyros nodded once, jaw tight. Euenos rose too. "I'll go." Ariston looked at him. Euenos wasn't fast, but he was steady, and steady is useful at night. Ariston nodded. Dorion tried to sit up. "I can." Thaleia shoved him back down with one hand. "You can lie there and be quiet." Dorion muttered, "Tyrants." Thaleia's eyes flashed. "Yes." They went out into the night. The air outside was colder than it had been at dusk. The moon was thin, and clouds moved like bruises across it. The valley smelled of trampled grass and distant death. Ariston moved with controlled stiffness, spear in hand. Kyros followed close, shield held at an angle. Euenos walked behind them, knife ready. No one spoke. Speech can give away position. Speech also gives away fear, and fear at night sounds louder than footsteps. They reached the edge of the creek bed. Niko's description had been precise. Olive trees twisted like old hands, rocks piled uneven, shadows thick. Kyros' breath sounded too loud to his own ears. Ariston signaled 2 fingers downward. They crouched. Then they heard it, a whisper in the dark, not in Greek, a low murmur, 2 voices close. Euenos' mouth went dry. Kyros thought of Menon, how Menon had held without flinching, and he forced his trembling to stop by sheer will. Ariston waited until the murmuring came closer, until he could see movement. 2 silhouettes slipping between trees, slow and cautious, not charging, not hunting in confidence, predators embarrassed into caution. Raiders, then stragglers, men looking for easy revenge. One carried something that clinked softly, maybe stolen bronze. The other held a knife. They were coming toward the village. Ariston didn't charge. He did something better. He let them pass into the kill space, where the moonlight hit them for an instant and made them visible. Then he moved. It was not the glorious single charge of daylight legend. It was an ugly, silent violence. Kyros surged forward with him, shield first. He slammed into the nearer raider, driving him back into a tree. The man grunted, surprised, and tried to stab around the shield rim. Kyros felt the blade scrape his arm and pain flared, but he kept pressure. He thrust his spear once, awkward, and the point sank into the raider's stomach. The man's eyes went wide, his mouth opened. No sound came at first, then a wet gasp. Euenos tackled the second raider, not with elegance but with farmer strength. They hit the ground hard. The raider tried to wriggle free, knife flashing. Euenos caught the wrist, squeezed until tendons screamed and the knife fell. Then Euenos drove his own blade in once, twice, until the raider's struggle stopped. Ariston stood over Kyros' kill, watching for more movement. There was none. Only the night holding its breaths. Kyros stared down at the man dying against the tree, and something in him sickened. This wasn't battlefield killing where death is part of a machine. This was close, intimate, like slaughtering a goat. He swallowed hard. Ariston's voice was low, "You did well." Kyros flinched at the praise. It felt undeserved. Euenos wiped his knife on the grass, face blank. "More might come," he said. Ariston nodded. "They won't come here again," he said, and that was not a boast. It was a promise made to the night itself. They dragged the bodies away from the path and covered them with brush, not out of respect, but to prevent discovery that might guide other raiders. Then they returned to the village. Thaleia met them at the door, eyes searching faces. When she saw Kyros' arm bleeding, her expression tightened. "Inside," she snapped. "It's nothing," Kyros began, the same lie Ariston had tried earlier. Thaleia cut him off. "Spartans lie badly," she said again, and this time Dorion laughed weakly from his palate. Kyros sat, and Thaleia cleaned the cut with a roughness that bordered on anger. "Why are you angry?" Kyros asked before he could stop himself. Thaleia didn't look up. "Because," she said, voice flat, "I am tired of cleaning men." Kyros' throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. Thaleia's hands paused for one heartbeat, then resumed. "But I will," she added, quieter, "because if I don't, the world becomes only killing." Ariston listened from the corner, and for the first time since the battle he allowed his eyes to close just for a breath. Not sleep. A moment of letting the tension loosen. When he opened them, his gaze found Thaleia. She was bent over Kyros' arm, hair falling forward, lamplight catching the soot on her cheek. She looked exhausted and fierce and alive. Ariston realized something dangerous. Not that he admired her, that was easy. That he needed her. Not in the crude way men speak about women when they are drunk, in the way a commander needs water, in the way a city needs a wall. Sparta had trained him to believe need is weakness. But the border had taught a different lesson. Need is what binds people into something worth defending. Thaleia finished binding Kyros' arm and stood. For a moment, the room settled into that late-night lull where everyone pretends the worst is past. Then a distant sound reached them, faint, carried on wind. Not a horns. A scream. From outside the village, far but not too far. Ariston stood instantly, spear in hand. Kyros' body tensed. Euenos rose. Thalia's face went hard again. What was that? She whispered. Ariston's eyes narrowed. A survivor, he said, or a scout. Another sound followed, shouting, then the unmistakable clatter of running feet. One of Ariston's sentries burst into the house, breathless. Commander, the man said, they're back, some of them, a band, maybe 50. 50? Not 40,000, but enough to murder a village in the dark. Ariston's face did not change, but the room felt colder. Thaleia's voice was tight. Can you fight again? Ariston looked at his men, exhausted, wounded, some barely standing. Then he looked at Thaleia. Yes, he said, we can fight again, we must. Dorion, pale as bone, tried to push himself up. Finally, he rasped, something relaxing. Thaleia glared at him, lie down. Dorion smiled faintly, no. Kyros stood gripping his spear, his arm ached, his stomach turned. But he remembered Menon's last command, stay in the wall, and he stepped into place. Euenos tightened his grip on his knife, eyes distant. Niko clung to the wall, terrified. Thaleia grabbed him by the shoulders and shoved him toward the back room. Hide, she ordered, no hero. Niko nodded, tears on his cheeks, and disappeared behind the curtain. Ariston shouted orders, quick, precise. Shields, doorways, don't chase, hold, if they burn we cut them down. The veterans moved out into the night again, forming small shield groups guarding the narrow approaches. Villagers armed themselves with axes and hunting bows. Women carried water not just for wounds now, but to stop fire if it came again. Outside, the dark shifted with approaching footsteps. A band of invaders, wounded pride driving them, came for the village like thieves coming back for what they think was stolen from them. And the Spartans, exhausted but unbroken, prepared to show them that even after the single charge, the real war was endurance. They came without horns this time. No drums, no banners, no grand confidence. Just footsteps in the dark, too many of them trying to move quietly but failing, because 50 men with weapons always sound like 50 men with weapons. Metal taps stone, leather creaks, someone whispers a curse too loudly, someone breathes too hard. Ariston positioned his veterans the way you position stones in a narrow stream, not to stop the water, but to force it through places where it loses strength. The border settlement had 3 main approaches, 2 wider paths used by carts, and 1 narrow cut between boulders where goats could climb. Ariston blocked the wide paths with shield groups and stationed 2 archers on rooftops where they could shoot down without exposing themselves. The narrow cut was the dangerous one. A few men could slip through there and set fire to roofs from behind. So Ariston placed Euenos there with 4 others, men who could hold in tight spaces and fight with short blades. Don't be brave, Ariston told them, be stubborn. Euenos nodded, expression hard, I can do stubborn. Kyros was assigned to the main doorway area near Thaleia's house because Ariston knew the invaders would be drawn to lamplight like moths. Light means supplies, light means wounded, light means easy kills. Dorion insisted on joining despite Thaleia's fury. He moved slower now, leaning on his spear like an old man's staff, but his eyes were clear and his voice when he spoke still carried. Thaleia followed Ariston out, stopping him just outside the door. The night wind lifted loose hair across her face. You're going to die, she said, not as a plea, but as an accusation against fate. Ariston looked at her. Not tonight, he said. Thaleia's eyes glistened in the dark. You don't get to decide that. Ariston's mouth tightened. I decide what I can, he said. Then he added lower so only she could hear, stay inside. Thaleia's chin lifted. No. Ariston didn't argue with her, not because he agreed, but because he couldn't afford the time. He only said, if you must be outside, stay behind the second wall. Thaleia nodded once, accepting the boundary like a warrior accepting formation. Then the first invaders appeared at the edge of moonlight. Kyros saw them first, moving shapes low and quick, not a disciplined line, a band. They came with torches, 2 or 3, held low to avoid being seen too early. Their intent was clear, burn the houses, force the defenders to scatter, and then kill in the confusion. Ariston's voice cut the dark. Archers. 2 arrows hissed down from rooftops. One struck a torchbearer in the chest. The torch dropped, rolling, setting dry grass alight for a moment before a villager kicked dirt over it. The second arrow missed and clattered against stone. The invaders froze. For a heartbeat they hesitated, reassessing. They hadn't expected organized defense. They had expected a village collapsed into relief and grief. Then one of them, a man with a scar down his cheek, shouted in a harsh language and surged forward, blade raised. That was the spark. The band rushed. They split naturally, some toward the cart path, some toward Thaleia's house, some trying to circle wide for flanking angles. Ariston held his men until the last possible moment, until the attackers were close enough that courage had committed them and retreat would feel like failure. Then Ariston shouted, "Now!" The Spartans surged out from shadow, shields up, spears low, and met the band in a brutal collision at the first wall. This fight was nothing like the daylight battle. There was no mass to manipulate, no huge formation to crack. This was knife work, ambush work, fast violence in tight spaces. Kyros took the first impact at his section. An invader swung a short axe at his head. Kyros raised his shield and felt the impact like a hammer blow. His shoulder screamed. He shoved forward using body weight rather than strength and thrust his spear into the man's thigh. The man collapsed with a howl. A second invader lunged in, trying to stab around the shield rim. Dorion stepped in with a short sword, somehow he had acquired it, and slashed across the attacker's forearm. The man screamed and dropped his blade. Dorion's face tightened with pain from the movement. Still, he muttered, "See, useful." Kyros glanced at him, breathless. "You should be lying down." Dorion's eyes flashed. "You should be winning." The invaders tried to push into the village proper, but the Spartans didn't retreat. They held the chokepoint. Every time an attacker pressed forward, a spearpoint found him. Every time the band tried to shift left or right, shields adjusted, overlapping like jaws. They weren't 700 now, not fully. Only a fraction could be at each approach. But the principle was the same as in the valley. Deny space, deny rhythm, deny hope. At the narrow cut between boulders, Uinos and his four heard footsteps first, soft, careful. This group was smarter, they weren't charging. They were sneaking, hopping to slip behind defenses. Uinos crouched behind a rock, knife in hand. His breath came slow. His mind, tired of killing, became cold and simple. A shadow slid into the cut. Uinos waited until the man passed him, then grabbed from behind, clamped a hand over the mouth, and drove the knife up under the ribs. The invader convulsed, eyes wide, hands scrabbling at Uinos' arm. Uinos held until the shaking stopped. He lowered the body silently and looked at his own hand, already wet again. A second shadow came. This time Uinos' partner, a veteran named Hagnon, threw a stone. The stone struck the man's helmet with a sharp crack, stunning him. Uinos stepped forward and finished it. Two more tried to retreat, but the cut was narrow. Retreat turned into collision. The Spartans struck quickly, savagely, and the sneaking group died in the rocks without ever seeing the village. Uinos' chest heaved. Hagnon whispered, "Farmers." Uinos didn't answer. He thought briefly of fields again, then he shoved the thought away. There would be time later or there wouldn't. Back at the main path, the band began to understand they were not going to take easy revenge. They tried a new tactic, set fire at a distance. A torch flew in an arc and landed on a roof edge, catching dry reeds. Flames began to lick upward. Thaleia, behind the second wall, saw it and moved like lightning. She grabbed a wet hide and flung it onto the flames, smothering them. Another villager followed with a bucket. The fire died, hissing. The invaders shouted in frustration. Ariston saw the torch tactic and barked, "Kill torchbearers first." Archers adjusted, arrows found hands holding fire, torches dropped. Darkness reclaimed the attackers. Without light, the band's courage faltered. They were in unfamiliar ground, facing disciplined killers who could fight in shadow. Still, they kept coming because pride is a whip. One invader broke through for a moment, slipping around a shield edge and sprinting toward Thaleia's house, blade up, eyes wild. Kyros saw him late. The invader was fast, too fast. Kyros lunged, but his footing slipped on loose gravel. His spear went wide. The invader reached the doorway. And then Thaleia stepped forward from behind the second wall with a woodcutter's axe in her hands. Not a warrior's axe, a working tool heavy and honest. She swung once. The axe caught the invader in the shoulder and neck. The impact was sickening. The man fell like a puppet with its strings cut. Thaleia stood over him, chest rising and falling, hair blown across her face, eyes fierce. Kyros stared at her in shock. Thaleia looked at him and snapped, "Close your mouth." Kyros shuddered. Ariston saw what she'd done. He didn't praise her, he didn't scold her. He only nodded once, the same nod he gave a soldier who had done necessary work. And Thaleia, unbelievably, felt warmth in that nod. Not approval. Respect. The band began to retreat. Not all at once, not cleanly. First a few stepped back, then more. A man shouted that the village was cursed, that Spartans were demons, that there was no loot worth dying for. Another shouted that they should burn it anyway. But when he tried to raise a torch, an arrow pinned his hand to a wooden post. He screamed and dropped it. That scream broke something. The band turned and ran into the dark, dragging wounded, leaving dead behind. The night swallowed them. Ariston didn't chase. He knew better. Chasing into darkness is how you die to an ambush. It is how discipline dissolves into anger. The Spartans had won because they refused to be emotional in their tactics, even when their hearts were on fire. He ordered the sentries to tighten, to watch the approaches until dawn. Then slowly, the defenders gathered in the dim light near Thaleia's house. People looked at each other with the wide-eyed disbelief of the living. Dorion leaned on his spear, pale and sweating, and muttered, "That was unpleasant." Thaleia shot him a look, "Go lie down." Dorion managed a grin, "You're obsessed." Thaleia stepped closer, and Dorion's grin faltered when he saw her expression. "You are bleeding again," she said. Dorion glanced down and swore softly. His makeshift bandage had soaked through. Ariston spoke, voice low, "Inside now." Dorion opened his mouth to argue, but then he saw Ariston's eyes, hard, not angry, just absolute. Dorion nodded, "Yes, commanders." Kyros followed them inside, trembling as the adrenaline drained. His arm burned where the axe had struck his shield earlier. His shoulder felt half dislocated. He sat on the floor and realized his hands were shaking again. Thaleia came to him with water. He looked up at her, "You killed him." Thaleia's face was blank for a second, then she said, "Yes." Kyros swallowed, "Does it?" He didn't know how to finish. Thaleia understood anyway. She sat beside him, not too close. "It doesn't feel like stories," she said. Kyros nodded, eyes stinging, "No." Thaleia looked down at her own hands, one still gripping the axe handle as if letting go would make her fall apart. "It feels like cleaning," she said. "Like cutting meat, like doing what has to be done." Kyros whispered, "Menon died." Thaleia's gaze lifted. She didn't know Menon, not personally, but she knew the cost. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Kyros's mouth twisted. Ariston says Menon won't be in the story. Thaleia's eyes hardened. "Then we make our own story," she said. "We speak his name, we speak all of them." Kyros stared at her and something in him steadied. Not healed, steadied. Ariston entered quietly and listened to the last words. He didn't correct her. He didn't argue. He only said, "Before dawn the outpost men arrive. We will send word farther. The invasion is broken but not ended." Thaleia stood wiping her hands on her skirt. "And the dead?" she asked. Ariston's face tightened. "At first light," he said, "we bury ours, we burn what must be burned, we do not leave bodies for dogs." Thaleia nodded, "And theirs." Ariston looked toward the dark valley, where thousands had fled and hundreds lay behind. For a moment, something like weariness touched his eyes. "Their gods can find them," he said. Thaleia's voice was quiet but firm. "They were men," she said. Ariston looked at her sharply. Thaleia didn't blink. "Men burn too," she said. "Men rot too. If we leave them, sickness will come. If we leave them, the smell will bring wolves." Ariston held her gaze, then he nodded once. "Then we will burn them," he said, "far from the wells." Dorion's lying back down muttered, "Merciful." Thaleia snapped, "Practical." Dorion smiled faintly, "Same thing sometimes." The house settled again into exhausted quiet. Outside, the sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly, a thin gray seep at the horizon. Niko emerged from hiding and crawled to Thaleia's side. He looked at the axe, at her hands, at the blood. "Are we safe?" he whispered. Thaleia looked at him, then at Ariston, then at the room full of wounded men who had held the night again. "We're alive," she said, "that's what we have." Ariston, hearing her, felt that pinch in his chest again. Need, recognition, something dangerously close to tenderness. He turned his face away as if the gesture could hide it. Because at dawn, commanders must become stone again. They must count bodies. They must decide who walks and who is carried. They must decide what to do with victory and how to keep it from turning into another kind of defeat. And at first light, when the fog of night lifted, the valley would show its true cost in full. Dawn did not arrive like a promise. It arrived like a witness. A thin gray light crept over the ridge and into the valley, and as it strengthened it revealed what darkness had hidden, not just bodies but the shape of what had happened. The ground was torn, smeared, trampled into something that no longer looked like earth. Broken spears lay like dead reeds. Shields, Spartan and invader alike, were scattered in wrong places, as if the battle had shaken them loose from the men they belonged to. And the dead. They were everywhere. Some lay as if asleep. Some lay twisted in postures that made the living look away quickly. A few were still alive, barely, moving mouths, hands twitching, a quiet moan like an animal caught in a trap. The border settlement woke slowly into horror. Villagers came out with cloths over their faces, eyes already red from smoke and sleeplessness. Some carried spades, some carried ropes, some carried nothing at all and simply stood, unable to accept that the land they'd walked yesterday had become this. Ariston stood on the ridge and watched without speaking for a long time. Kyros stood near him, shoulders stiff. He hadn't slept. None of the veterans had slept properly. They had dozed in fragments, waking at every sound. In the early light, Kyros looked younger again, only because exhaustion stripped away the hard mask and left the raw human underneath. Dorion emerged from Thaleia's house supported by two men, stubbornly upright. His face was pale and his eyes were too bright. He was losing blood slowly, the kind of slow loss that can kill a man while he insists he's fine. Thaleia followed, carrying a bundle of linen and a jar of oil. She looked like she'd aged a year overnight, but her posture was straight. Niko walked behind her, silent. Ariston finally spoke. "We start with ours," he said. "It wasn't favoritism, it was necessity. You take care of your dead first so your living can keep standing." They moved down into the valley in small groups, each led by a veteran who could recognize faces under grime. This part of war is rarely told well because it doesn't sound heroic. It is hard labor, and it breaks men in a different way. Kyros found Menon. Someone had already brought Menon closer to the ridge in the night, laying him on a cloak. His face was calmer in daylight, almost ordinary, like a man resting after fieldwork. Kyros knelt. His hands hovered over Menon's chest, not touching at first. A strange hesitation, fear that if he touched, the reality would become final. Dorion limped to him and stopped. Kyros looked up. Dorion's voice was quiet, stripped of humor. "He saved us," Dorion said. Kyros nodded, throat tight. Dorion crouched with a wince and reached out, touching Menon's shoulder once, lightly, as if not to disturb him. Then Dorion said something unexpected. "He used to steal my bread," he murmured. Kyros blinked, confused. Dorion's mouth twisted. "Not because he was hungry," he said, "because he liked watching me get angry." Kyros felt a laugh try to escape and then choke into a sob. Dorion's eyes flicked to him. "Don't," Dorion said, but his voice was gentler now. "Not here, later." Kyros wiped his face with his forearm and nodded. He swallowed down the sound. They lifted Menon together. Two men at the shoulders, two at the legs, careful, controlled, as if by gentleness they could repay something. They carried him back toward the village, where a small burial ground lay beyond the last stone wall. Thaleia directed villagers to dig. The soil was rocky and stubborn. Spades hit stones with dull clunks, men cursed under their breath. Women wiped sweat from brows and kept digging anyway. Ariston watched, then took a spade. A villager stared, shocked to see a Spartan commander digging. Ariston didn't explain. He simply drove the spade down and lifted earth again and again. His ribs complained, but he ignored them. Thaleia saw him, and for a moment her expression shifted. Something like surprise, then something like respect deepening into a quieter feeling she didn't name. When the graves were ready, the Spartans laid their dead in them with minimal ceremony. No long speeches, no songs. Sparta did not do elaborate mourning. It believed mourning made men soft. But the truth was, they mourned in other ways. In silence, in clenched jaws, in the way a soldier's hand lingered 1 second too long on a friend's shoulder before letting go. Kyros stood as Menon was lowered. Thaleia, without asking, placed the cracked bronze mirror on the earth beside Menon, just for a moment, catching the dawn light, reflecting it onto his still face. Kyros stared at the mirror, puzzled. Thaleia said quietly, so someone remembers his face. Ariston heard her. His eyes flicked to her, then to the mirror, then away. After the Spartan dead were buried, they turned to the invader dead. This was different. The invaders had come to destroy. Many villagers hated them fiercely. Some spat on bodies. Others stood trembling, sick with revulsion. Thaleia intervened. "Stop," she ordered, voice sharp as a whip. A man, one of the village elders, snapped back, "They would have burned us." Thaleia's eyes burned. "Yes," she said, "and now they're dead, don't become what they are." The elder's face tightened, but he lowered his gaze. Not because he agreed, but because Thaleia's authority in this moment was undeniable. Ariston listened and said nothing. He had his own reasons for allowing discipline among civilians: disease, smell, wolves, the morale of his wounded. But he also understood something Thaleia understood. If the village turned into a place where hatred ruled openly, it would poison the living long after the invaders were gone. They built pyres far from the wells. Wood was dragged from storage. Broken carts were dismantled. Oil was poured. The smell of oil over death is distinctive, thick, nauseating, final. When the fires were lit, the smoke rose in long black columns, visible for miles. It was a signal to anyone watching: this land has bled. This land is not easy. As the pyres burned, the outpost reinforcements arrived. 27 men, dusty, tense, weapons ready. Their leader, a small officer with a scar on his chin, stared at the valley and whistled low. "By the gods," the officer murmured, "what happened here?" Dorion, leaning against a wall, said, "A misunderstanding." The officer looked confused. Dorion added, "They misunderstood how hard we are to kill." Thaleia rolled her eyes. Kyros almost smiled. Ariston stepped forward to meet the officer. They spoke quickly: news, orders, messages to carry. Ariston sent runners to Sparta and to allied towns, describing the invasion attempt and the route, emphasizing that scattered enemy groups might still roam. Then came the dangerous part. Once the immediate survival tasks are done, people start shaping meaning. Meaning becomes politics. Politics becomes blame. The village elders gathered near Thaleia's house, faces tight. They had survived, yes, but now they looked at the destruction: the burned hut, the trampled fields, the dead animals, and fear turned into anger. One elder spoke first, voice trembling. "This happened because we were a target," he said, "because Sparta draws wars like flies." Another snapped, "We would have been slaughtered without Sparta." A third said, bitter, "And now we will starve because our harvest is trampled." Voices rose. Thaleia stood in the doorway and watched, arms crossed. She knew this argument. She had heard versions of it every year: resentment toward Sparta's distant authority, gratitude for Spartan protection, anger at being a battlefield. Ariston listened from a short distance, face unreadable. Then one elder pointed at Ariston and said what many were thinking, but few dared to speak aloud. "You brought the battle here," he accused. "You could have retreated. You could have let them pass and fought elsewhere." The courtyard fell quiet. Even Dorion stopped joking. Kyros' body tensed. His hand went to his spear, not because he would strike an elder, but because his whole being was trained to respond to threat. Thaleia's eyes narrowed dangerously. Ariston stepped forward. He did not shout, he did not posture. "I did bring the battle here," he said. "I chose where it would be fought." The elder's face hardened. "So you admit it?" Ariston's gaze held steady. "Yes," he said, "because if I had retreated, they would have burned your houses while we ran. They would have taken your children while we fought in the hills. They would have killed you in your beds." A murmur spread. Ariston continued, voice calm and terrible. "You want to believe you had a better option because better options make you feel safe. There were none. The elder opened his mouth, but Ariston cut through him with a single sentence. If you want to blame someone, Ariston said, blame the 40,000 who came to take what is yours. A silence. Then another elder spoke quieter, and what now, he asked. They will return. Ariston nodded slowly. Maybe, he said, but they will not return as 40,000 today. Their leaders will fight each other over who failed. Their survivors will tell stories about a valley where the ground ate men. Thaleia stepped forward then, unable to hold herself back. Ariston, she said. The way she spoke his name, plain, without title, made the elder stiffen. Spartan commanders were not usually addressed so directly by border women. Ariston looked at her. Thaleia's voice softened slightly. What do you need? Ariston's eyes flicked across the village. The wounded, the dead, the smoke, the frightened faces. Food, he said, clean water, a place for the wounded, and time. Thaleia nodded. You'll have those, she said. Then because she was Thaleia, she added, but you will also answer questions. Not to the elders, she glanced at them with contempt, but to the living, to the children. They will ask what happened. You will not let liars tell them. Ariston's jaw tightened, because Sparta's instincts were secrecy, control, myth. Still, he said, what would you have me say? Thaleia's eyes shone. Say the truth, she said. Say it was not gods, say it was men holding together, say names. Ariston's gaze drifted to Kyros, to Dorion, to where Menon had been lowered into earth. He nodded once slow. Tonight, he said. That evening, as the sun began to lower again, villagers and soldiers gathered in Thaleia's courtyard, not for celebration, for explanation, for the kind of storytelling that stitches a ripped world back together. Ariston sat on a low stone, ribs aching, and looked at the faces around him. Frightened villagers, exhausted veterans, wounded men propped against walls, children pressed close to mothers. Niko sat in the front, eyes fixed on Ariston, the strip of cloak still tied around his wrist. Thaleia stood behind the group, arms folded, watching Ariston like she could will honesty out of him. Dorion lay nearby on a pallet, pale, listening. Kyros sat with his hands clasped, waiting. Ariston drew a slow breath and began to speak. He did not start with glory. He started with the pause before dawn, the moment when 700 men looked down at 40,000 and decided to move anyway. And as he spoke, the legend began to take a different shape. Not 700 crushed 40,000, but 700 held long enough to break 40,000's unity. He spoke of the seam, the wedge, the pivot. He spoke of horns cut short, of fear spreading. He spoke of men like Esthenel who spent their lives to silence sound. And then, when the courtyard was quiet enough that even the wounded had stopped groaning for a moment, Ariston said the names. He said Menon. He said Esthenel. He said others, some of whom no one else would ever record. Kyros felt his throat tighten when he heard Menon's name spoken like it mattered. Thaleia closed her eyes briefly, relief and grief mixing like smoke and salt. And in that courtyard with the pyre smoke still in the air, the story became not propaganda but memory, messy, costly, human. Yet even as Ariston spoke, a rider arrived at the edge of the village, dusty and urgent. He shouted for Ariston. Ariston stopped speaking. The crowd held its breaths. Because bad news always rides fast. Ariston rose stiff and went to meet the messenger. The messenger's face was grim. Commander, he said, scouts report survivors gathering in the hills. Not thousands, but enough, and they are arguing. Some want to return for revenge before they scatter. Ariston's eyes narrowed. Thaleia stepped forward, hearing. Tonight, she asked. The messenger nodded, maybe. Ariston looked back at the gathered villagers and soldiers. He looked at the wounded. He looked at the children. He realized the truth. The great battle might be over, but survival was not finished. And the final act of this story would not be the charge. It would be what they chose to do with broken enemies and broken bodies, how they would prevent revenge from becoming another cycle. Ariston turned to Kyros and Dorion and the remaining veterans. Rest if you can, he said, eat, sharpen blades. Then to Thaleia, in a voice only she could hear, he said, if they come again tonight, keep the children in the cellar. Thaleia nodded, jaw set, and you? Ariston's eyes met hers. I will be at the wall, he said. And in that look between them, hard, exhausted, alive, something passed that was not romance in the soft sense, but something deeper and more dangerous. Two people recognizing that they were now bound by what they had survived together. The sun sank. The smoke drifted. The village prepared again.